In the ghettos, before the gas chambers and before the trains, it was the women who felt the world collapse first. Picture this: not a battlefield, not soldiers, but a mother standing in a one-room apartment, her child crying from hunger, so deep it no longer sounds human, and outside her window, German guards hammering shut the final planks sealing the ghetto gates. In that moment, she realizes she is trapped in a city that is already dying. She presses her hand over her child's mouth, not to silence them, but because she doesn't know how to explain that there is no more food, no more safety, and no more world beyond those walls. Every day after that becomes a fight against hunger, against disease, against elections, against despair itself. Daughters carry buckets of smuggled potatoes, twice their weight. Grandmothers sell the last memories of better days. And young women risk their lives crossing cracked bricks in the ghetto wall, because one loaf of bread might buy one more night of life. The Nazis thought the ghettos would break them, starve them, erase them. But what unfolded inside those walls was something the world has almost forgotten. Women who fought to keep families alive even when everything around them was built to make them disappear. This is their story. And once you enter those streets with them, you won't be able to look away. Chapter 1. Before the Walls. Women's Lives Before the Ghettos. She would remember the sound for the rest of her life. A single nail being driven into a wooden beam. Sharp. Final. A sound that meant the ghetto gates were about to close forever. But before that moment, before the walls, before the hunger, before the silence of streets where children once played, Jewish women lived lives that now feel impossibly distant, like memories blurred by frost on a window pane. To understand how everything collapsed, we must begin in the world they tried so hard to hold on to. A world that was ordinary, fragile, and already trembling. Before the war, in cities like Warsaw, Krakow, Lodz, and Vilna, Jewish women woke to the scent of warm bread drifting from corner bakeries and the distant bells of trams clattering along cobblestone streets. Mornings carried the soft clatter of enamel pots, the scratch of brooms sweeping courtyards, and the chatter of neighbors leaning out of windows. It was a world where life felt predictable, where mothers walked children to school at a pace slow enough to savor gossip, and where daughters hurried to classes with books pressed tightly to their chests. Yet beneath the softness of these scenes was a tension that no one wanted to acknowledge, a shadow of anti-Semitism growing just out of sight. Many Jewish women lived in tight-knit families where roles were clearly drawn, but never simple. Some worked in textile shops, managing looms or stitching clothes by hand, their fingers stained with dye and needle pricks. Others ran small groceries, standing behind counters stocked with pickles, onions, flour, and the sweet, sharp smell of herring in barrels. Many balanced work with raising large families, waking before dawn to light stoves, pack lunches, and get children ready while the city yawned itself awake. Their days were a constant movement, a choreography of care that kept their homes breathing. Education played a growing role in their world. By the early 1900s, Jewish girls were filling classrooms at rates that startled the older generations. You could see them in schoolyards, their hair braided, their notebooks worn along the edges from constant use. Some attended gymnasiums, the high-level secondary schools of Europe, while others studied Hebrew texts in informal groups or learned typing to pursue secretarial work. A new generation was emerging, women who demanded knowledge, who wanted more than the narrow future society offered. They discussed literature, spoke multiple languages, and walked home with heads full of dreams that felt startlingly modern. But even in these years of cultural bloom, the air was shifting. You could hear it first in whispers behind closed doors. A neighbor muttering about rising tensions. A shopkeeper complaining about new boycotts. Newspapers running stories that felt more threatening with each passing month. Anti-Semitism had always existed like a low, constant hum, but by the 1930s it began to sharpen, becoming a blade pressed slowly against daily life. Women felt it when Polish universities restricted Jewish admissions, when anti-Semitic slogans appeared on walls, or when customers suddenly turned their faces away, as if Jewish businesses were invisible. These moments stung, subtle but unmistakable, like stones tossed lightly at a window before the real attack began. Inside their homes, however, life still held its rituals. Mothers lit Sabbath candles every Friday evening, their hands trembling slightly, as if the flames themselves carried both blessing and warning. The rooms filled with the thick aroma of chicken simmering in broth, the sweet scent of challah, and the soft rustle of tablecloths smoothed with practiced hands. Children gathered close, listening to the familiar prayers that had crossed generations. For those few hours, the outside world with its shifting winds felt distant. The walls of the home became a kind of sanctuary, small, intimate, easily shattered. Jewish women were central to the economy of these cities in ways that history often forgets. In textile factories, their footsteps echoed in vast halls where machines hissed and clattered. In marketplaces, their voices rose above the din as they bargained, sold produce, and carried heavy baskets that cut into their palms. They worked as seamstresses, midwives, teachers, bookkeepers. Their earnings weren't extra. They were essential. Women kept families fed, clothed, and sheltered. Women kept neighborhoods alive. But earning a living became harder as anti-Semitic policies expanded. Licenses were denied. Taxes increased. Permits vanished. And slowly, doors that had once been open began to slam shut. Culturally, Jewish women inhabited a world rich with music, theater, and tradition. Yiddish theaters glowed at night, their stages filled with actors who made people laugh, cry, and forget their troubles for a moment. Women attended these plays wearing their best dresses, feeling the hum of conversation, the warmth of crowded seats, and the thrill of shared stories. In Jewish cafes, poets recited verses thick with emotion, their voices trembling in candlelight. Young women leaned in, soaking up each word, dreaming of futures shaped by art, not survival. These small freedoms, these nights of beauty, were the threads that held their identities together. Yet danger was tightening like a storm cloud. By the late 1930s, the streets felt different. The air carried an edge of fear. Women noticed soldiers marching past with boots that struck the pavement like warnings. New laws restricted where Jewish families could go. Newspapers filled with messages that blamed Jews for the world's problems. Children came home shaken from school, repeating cruel insults they'd heard from classmates. Women felt the shift acutely, like a mother sensing a fever in her child long before it breaks. Something was coming, something vast, something violent, but they did not yet understand its shape. Still, they prepared in their own quiet ways. Mothers stored extra flour when they could afford it. Daughters learned to mend clothing more efficiently. Families saved coins in jars hidden beneath floorboards. They did not speak openly about fear. Speaking gave fear power, but their hands moved differently, their choices sharper, more urgent. The rhythms of daily life were unchanged on the surface, but underneath, decisions were guided by instinct. Stay alert, save everything, trust your senses. Senses mattered. Women heard the rising hostility in the way neighbors' voices shifted. They saw shopkeepers hesitate before welcoming them inside. They felt the cold prickle of eyes on their backs when walking through markets. They smelled burning fear when rumors spread of Jewish homes being vandalized in distant towns. They tasted anxiety in every meal, food suddenly heavy and difficult to swallow. The world's colors dimmed slowly, subtly, as if someone were lowering the brightness on an entire civilization. In villages, shtetls, and towns across Eastern Europe, Jewish women carried on with a courage that felt both ordinary and astonishing. They organized charitable groups to help poor families, visited the sick, and taught younger girls the meaning of resilience. They prepared celebrations, even when money was short, believing joy could be a form of resistance. Weddings still took place, laughter breaking through the tension like bursts of sunlight. Babies were still born. Books were still read. Songs were still sung. Life continued because they made it continue. But the political landscape shifted rapidly after 1939, when German troops marched into Poland. The thunder of artillery, the roar of tanks, and the crack of gunfire ripped through cities that had known only the hum of daily life. In the chaos, women snatched their children, grabbed whatever they could carry, and ran for shelter as explosions shook windows and sent dust swirling through the air. The smell of smoke replaced the warm scent of morning bread. Fear thickened the streets. Rumors flew like sparks from a fire. Jews were being rounded up, registered, marked. No one knew what came next. Amid this collapse, Jewish women fought to preserve normalcy. They stood in endless lines for ration cards, negotiated with nervous shopkeepers, and comforted their children through nights filled with distant gunfire. They tried to rebuild routines, even as their neighborhoods filled with soldiers and new decrees appeared overnight. But every decree chipped away at their freedom. No entering certain streets, no riding trams, no owning businesses, no attending schools, no dignity, no protection. Each law was a stone added to a wall they could not yet see, but whose shadow already darkened their days. In these final months before the ghettos were created, despair and determination blended in strange ways. Women planned escapes that never materialized. They whispered about visas, certificates, and relatives abroad. Some hurried to teach their children survival skills, how to hide, how to stay quiet, how to sense danger by listening not to words, but to footsteps and tone. Mothers tucked documents into seams of clothing. Wives prepared bags in case they had to flee. Daughters watched their parents with wide, confused eyes, unable to comprehend why the world suddenly seemed to be turning upside down. Yet through all this, the ghettos were already forming, not with walls of brick at first, but with invisible lines drawn across the city. Jews banned from parks, from certain shops, from public benches, from schools, from hope. Women felt the walls closing in long before they were built. They saw it in the way friends avoided eye contact. They heard it in the military trucks rumbling down their streets. They sensed it in the silence that followed each new decree, a silence heavy as snow before a storm. The last days of freedom were filled with small, heartbreaking moments no historian could ever fully capture. A mother brushing her daughter's hair slower than usual, memorizing the texture because she sensed change was coming. A grandmother quietly packing family photographs, unsure if she would ever see her home again. A teenage girl writing in her diary that she felt something tightening around her life, like a pair of hands she could not see. And then, almost without warning, soldiers appeared with wooden beams, nails, and written orders. Streets were sealed. Homes were marked. Entire districts were declared Jewish residential zones. Women watched from windows as the walls went up, brick by brick, hearing the hammering that felt like a heartbeat counting down to something terrible. They understood then, too late, that the world they knew, the world of bakeries and trams, of Sabbath candles and laughter, of daughters hurrying to school and mothers bustling through markets, was disappearing forever. What awaited them behind those walls was not yet fully known. But the smell of sawdust from the newly built barriers mixed with the cold air carried a clear warning. The life before was over. A different world was beginning, and it would test every instinct they had ever relied on. The question now was not how they would live in the ghettos. The question was whether they would survive them at all. Chapter 2. The Invasion. When homes became traps. It began before dawn, long before most women had even opened their eyes to light the stove or wake the children. A low, distant rumble, like a storm that refused to reveal itself. At first, only a few noticed it. Milk vendors setting up their stalls, bakers carrying trays of unbaked bread, mothers slipping quietly into courtyards to collect water before the morning rush. The sound grew louder until it swallowed the city, until the air itself seemed to tremble. Then came the first explosion. Windows shook. Children screamed awake. Mothers ran to the doorways, their hearts hammering in their chests like fists against a locked door. In that instant, everything they knew about life, safety, routine, home, shattered. The Germans had arrived. As the sun rose over Poland that morning in September 1939, Women saw their once familiar streets fill with a kind of terror that did not understand hesitation. Tanks rolled down cobblestones, leaving tracks that carved into the memory of anyone who watched. Soldiers marched with rifles slung across their chests, boots striking pavement in a rhythm that sounded like an executioner's drum. Houses trembled with each blast of artillery. The smoke of burning fuel mixed with the cold morning air, creating a bitter scent that clung to hair, clothes, and skin. It was the smell of invasion, sharp, metallic, and unforgettable. Inside apartments, chaos unfolded. Mothers grabbed children from their beds, pulling them close as they tried to make sense of the thunder outside. Some families hurried into cramped basements where the air smelled of damp stone and mold, each step down the stairs echoing with fear. Others gathered at windows, peering through cracked panes as columns of German soldiers poured into the city. Women pressed their fingers to their lips to keep children silent. A single cry could draw attention. A moment of noise could invite danger. The invasion was swift and merciless. Cities fell in days, not weeks. The Polish army fought desperately, but outnumbered and outgunned, it was overwhelmed. Women saw soldiers retreating through the streets, their faces gray with exhaustion, uniforms torn, boots caked in mud, carrying wounded comrades on makeshift stretchers. Even young girls could sense that Poland was crumbling. The sky was darkened by smoke. The streets were littered with shattered glass and abandoned carts. The world they had known only days earlier, a world of bakeries, trams, laughter, and schoolyards, had vanished. As German control tightened, the first changes were subtle. A checkpoint here, a confiscated radio there. But women noticed. They always did. They saw soldiers break into homes to search for weapons or valuables, their leather gloves brushing past family photographs, as if memories meant nothing. They saw Jewish men lined up in courtyards, their hands raised as soldiers examined their identification papers. They heard warnings whispered from neighbor to neighbor, "Stay inside, stay quiet, stay invisible." The city itself had become a trap, and no one knew how to escape it. Within days, the first decrees were issued. Jewish families were ordered to register with local authorities. Women stood in long lines that stretched around buildings, clutching documents that, until then, had simply been a matter of identity. Now, those papers felt like sentences. The wind carried the sharp scent of ink and fear as officials stamped identification forms with a red J. Mothers held their children tighter as soldiers patrolled the lines, their boots grinding against gravel, as if crushing whatever hope remained beneath their heels. Life changed again when armbands became mandatory. White cloth with a blue Star of David, a mark that stripped away anonymity and safety. Women felt a rough fabric between their fingers as they tied it around their sleeves. It chafed their skin. It made their presence impossible to hide. Children asked why they had to wear it. Mothers struggled to find the words. How do you explain to a child that the world has decided they are dangerous, unwanted, less than human? Women noticed that after the armbands were introduced, the city's atmosphere shifted once more. Shopkeepers who once greeted them warmly now avoided eye contact. Some restaurants refused service. Banks turned them away. On trams, passengers moved aside, not out of courtesy, but out of contempt. That contempt hung in the air like smoke, heavy, lingering, and suffocating. Jewish women felt its sting in every gesture, every glance, every whispered insult. Then came the forced labor orders. Posters appeared on walls at dawn, glued so quickly that the paste still dripped down the bricks. Women between certain ages were commanded to report for work. Factories, road building, cleaning rubble after bombings. The tasks were backbreaking, the hours endless. Many were given tools far too heavy for their hands, shovels meant for large men, sacks of cement that strained their spines. They returned home with blistered palms, dust in their lungs, an exhaustion so deep it felt carved into their bones. Yet they continued, because refusing was not survival. Refusing meant punishment, and punishment under Nazi rule could mean death. As the occupation deepened, Women sensed an invisible line tightening around their lives. Homes were raided without warning. Polish neighbors were encouraged to report Jewish households for imagined offenses. On the streets, German soldiers stopped women to search their bags, their hands lingering too long, their eyes unkind. For many women, the invasion was not only a military takeover, it was a collapse of personal dignity, a violation of privacy, and a constant threat to their bodies. Some were assaulted, others were humiliated publicly. Young girls learned quickly to walk with their eyes on the ground, hoping invisibility might protect them. Rations were introduced next. Bread, sugar, flour, meat, all reduced to portions impossibly small, especially for Jewish families. Women stood in endless queues, the cold biting at their cheeks, their stomachs hollow from hunger. They could smell the bread from inside the shop long before reaching the counter. The smell was warm, rich, almost intoxicating, but the actual ration they received fit in the palm of a hand. Mothers learned to stretch meals in ways they never had before, watering down soups, reusing bones, slicing bread into pieces so thin they were almost transparent. Hunger became a constant companion, a quiet shadow that followed every step. In some neighborhoods, soldiers marched door to door demanding property lists. Women watched as their sewing machines, radios, furniture, even family heirlooms were cataloged and tagged. Eventually, many of these items were seized. A home that once felt warm and full became empty, hollow, stripped of the objects that carried memories. Children didn't understand why their toys disappeared. Women had no answers that could ease the sting. Cultural life, once a source of pride, joy, and hope, withered under occupation. Jewish theaters were shut down. Synagogues were vandalized or closed. Schools were restricted, then banned. Girls who had once walked confidently to classes now faced the ache of lost futures. Books were hidden under floorboards, wrapped in cloth like fragile relics. Women whispered stories at night, so children would not forget the melodies of their culture, the rhythms of prayers, the meaning of holidays. But every whisper was tinged with grief. They were preserving something that was being taken from them piece by piece. The emotional cost of the invasion was deeper than fear. It was the slow erosion of certainty. Women looked at their husbands and saw worry etched into their faces. They watched their children shrink into themselves, learning caution before they learned hope. Grandmothers muttered that they had seen dark times before, but even they admitted that this felt different. The air itself felt different, thicker, colder, hostile. And then the deportations began. Quiet first. A rumor here, a neighbor missing there. Women heard of Jews being forced onto trucks at night, taken away without explanation. Some whispered the word labor camps. Others said resettlement in the east. No one knew the truth, but the fear of the unknown was its own kind of terror. Women slept lightly, ears tuned to the creak of stairs or the thud of boots. Every knock at the door sent hearts racing. Many prepared small bags with essentials, documents, a bit of bread, a shawl. These bags sat by the door like silent witnesses of dread. Even as danger grew, women worked tirelessly to protect their families. They formed support networks, sharing information, food, and warnings. If a raid was rumored, they passed the news from window to window, street to street. They taught their children where to hide, how to stay quiet, how to run if necessary. This invisible web of care became one of the few defenses the community still had. Women became strategists, guardians, and protectors, their instincts sharpened by the knowledge that survival now depended on their vigilance. In the months following the invasion, the city was transformed into a cage. German patrols roamed the streets at all hours. New curfews were enforced. Jewish families were forbidden from traveling freely, attending certain markets, or using public transportation. Women noticed the change in soundscape. Fewer voices, fewer open shops, fewer signs of Jewish life in public. The city felt hollow, like something vital had been drained from it. As winter approached, the cold settled in with a cruelty that mirrored the occupation itself. Apartments grew icy. Coal was scarce and expensive. Women wrapped children in blankets, trying to keep the cold from seeping into their bones. Families spent evenings huddled together, listening to the wind whistle through gaps in the windows, the sound merging with distant gunfire or shouted orders. The cold made hunger worse. It made fear sharper. It made hope feel like something fragile enough to break under a breath. The final blow came with the announcement of Jewish districts, areas of the city where Jews were forced to live. Women watched as messengers posted signs declaring which streets were now forbidden and which were assigned. The streets they had walked their entire lives were suddenly off limits. Shops they had frequented were now unreachable. Homes that had belonged to Jewish families for generations were no longer theirs. And as families were ordered to move into overcrowded Jewish quarters, women realized the truth. This was the beginning of something dark, controlled, and deadly. Moving was chaotic. Families packed what little they had left into suitcases and sacks. Women carried infants on their hips, trying to soothe them while navigating through streets swarming with soldiers and displaced families. They heard the clatter of wagon wheels, the shuffle of feet, the murmur of panic. The air was filled with dust and the sharp smell of sweat. Children cried, their faces streaked with grime and tears. Grandmothers stumbled. Men tried to stay strong, but the weight of uncertainty was crushing. Some families resisted moving, but resistance was met with violence. Women witnessed beatings, arrests, and threats. German soldiers barked orders, their voices cold and final. There was no choice. The Jewish population was being herded into a few cramped blocks, forced into spaces too small to hold them. The streets of the Jewish district were already overflowing when many arrived. Apartments meant for one family now held 3 or 4. The air inside these rooms quickly turned stale, thick with the smell of sweat, kerosene lamps, and fear. Women tried to recreate life within these shrinking boundaries. They cooked on makeshift stoves, washed clothes in shared courtyards, and gathered news from passers-by. But everything felt temporary, uncertain. The soldiers continued to build barriers around the Jewish district, using wooden planks, barbed wire, and bricks. Women watched the walls rise higher each day. They heard the hammering echo through the streets, a sound that pierced through their sleep. Each nail driven into place was like a heartbeat counting down to something irreversible. And then came the final order. The gates would close. The day before the closure, women walked the streets in a daze, trying to memorize the world they had once known. The scent of bakeries they could no longer enter. The sight of trams they were no longer allowed to ride. The sound of a city that was still alive but beginning to silence its Jewish voice. They held their children's hands tighter, sensing that these were the last moments of a freedom they had once taken for granted. When the gates finally shut, the sound was unmistakable. Wood against wood. A heavy thud. A metal lock clicking into place. Women felt it in their chests like a blow. The air inside the ghetto shifted, thickened, as if the city itself exhaled and trapped them inside that breath. The walls were now real. The world outside had become unreachable. But what lay ahead was worse. Much worse. The starvation had barely begun. Chapter 3. Marked for Isolation. The creation of the ghettos. The walls did not appear all at once. They came slowly, quietly, like frost creeping across a window pane in the dead of night. Women felt them long before they saw them. They sensed it in the way soldiers began patrolling more frequently, in the tightening rules, in the whispered warnings passed from doorway to doorway. But nothing prepared them for the moment when the invisible boundaries of the Jewish districts began turning into real, physical, suffocating walls. It started with a single line of barbed wire, cutting across a familiar street like a wound, and every woman who looked at it felt the same cold truth. The world was dividing, and they were being pushed to one side of it. Families within these districts already lived under a cloud of fear, but the announcement that the area would be converted into a sealed ghetto struck with the weight of destiny. Women huddled around radios, straining to catch official statements through static. Others pieced together information from German posters nailed to lampposts, the glue still wet and dripping down the paper like tears. The words were clinical, bureaucratic, lacking any trace of humanity. Jews must remain within designated zones. Movement is restricted. Violation is punishable by death. Women read these lines with trembling hands, feeling the letters dig into their skin like broken glass. Inside homes, panic grew. Mothers paced small apartments, their footsteps soft and frantic on worn wooden floors. They whispered to husbands, to sisters, to neighbors through thin walls about what to pack, how to prepare, what to expect. Outside, the smell of dust and freshly cut wood filled the streets as German soldiers and forced Jewish laborers began the work of constructing walls. The sharp metallic clang of hammers striking nails echoed endlessly, each strike a reminder that the perimeter was closing and time was running out. The neighborhood transformed around them. Wooden barricades rose where shops had once stood, blotting out sunlight and dividing streets in half. Soldiers shouted orders. Jewish men were forced to carry heavy planks and bricks, their bodies bent under the weight, their shirts soaked with sweat. Women watched from windows that had lost their view, feeling helpless as the men they loved were pushed and beaten while building the very prison meant to contain them. The air tasted of sawdust, sweat, and fear, a bitter, gritty combination that clung to the back of the throat. Inside homes, families began reorganizing their lives to fit the shrinking world. Women were the ones who made the impossible decisions. What to bring, what to abandon, what memories could fit into a suitcase. They ran their fingers over family photographs, the smooth surfaces already worn from years of handling. Some wrapped the photos in cloth and placed them carefully in bags. Others hid them beneath floorboards, praying that one day they might return. The weight of choosing what parts of a life to save pressed heavily on their chests. Day by day, the streets became more crowded as thousands of Jews were forced into fewer and fewer blocks. The once familiar smell of freshly baked bread from nearby bakeries was replaced by the sour odor of too many families crammed into too little space. Women held their children's hands tightly as they navigated streets, now overflowing with people dragging carts, pushing wheelbarrows, carrying bags that seemed too heavy for their thin arms. The sound of crying babies mixed with the shouts of soldiers and the rumble of wagons, creating a constant, chaotic hum that drowned out hope. When the final order came to seal the ghetto, women heard it not through radios or posters, but through the pounding of boots on cobblestones and the scraping sound of wooden beams being lowered into place. Germany's occupation police went house to house, shouting for families to stay inside. Women stood at windows, watching soldiers nail the last boards across the gates. Some pressed their palms against the glass, feeling the cool surface tremble with each blow of the hammer. That sound, a dull, heavy thud, would echo in their memories long after the war. And then, silence. The kind of silence that comes after something vital has been severed. The kind that fills the lungs with dread. Inside the sealed ghetto, life changed immediately. Space was tight, suffocatingly so. Apartments designed for one family now held 3 or 4. Women rearranged furniture to create makeshift sleeping spaces. Mattresses were placed on floors. Children slept curled up on blankets near doors, their small bodies grateful for any warmth. The close quarters intensified everything. Arguments, laughter, fear. The air inside these crowded rooms grew thick with the smell of cooking fires, unwashed clothes, and the unmistakable odor of too many people sharing too small a space. Food became a daily battle. The Germans' ration for Jews was so small it bordered on starvation. Women waited in lines that stretched for blocks, clutching ration cards that felt more like lifelines than pieces of paper. They felt hunger gnawing at their stomachs, their children tugging at their skirts, whining for something to eat. The shops they were allowed to access had little on their shelves. A few potatoes, stale bread, sometimes nothing at all. The hollow look in the shopkeeper's eyes told them everything they needed to know. The starvation was intentional. Inside homes, women turned into master improvisers. They boiled potato peels, made soups from scraps, and rationed bread so thin it nearly fell apart in their hands. They learned to cook weeds gathered from courtyards, to turn flour dust into dough, to make something from nothing. The kitchens of the ghetto, if one could call them that, smelled of desperation and determination in equal measure. The steam rising from pots carried more than the scent of food. It carried the weight of survival. Disease followed hunger like a shadow. The ghetto was overcrowded, filthy, and cut off from basic medical supplies. Women heard the coughing from neighboring apartments, deep, rattling coughs that signaled the fever spreading through the district. Typhus, lice, dysentery. Illness moved through the ghetto like a relentless tide. Mothers tried to keep their children clean, scrubbing them with cold water stored in metal buckets, the icy touch making the children cry out. Women boiled what little water they could find, the steam fogging windows and momentarily blurring the harshness outside. Despite everything, women clung to the small rituals that reminded them they were still human beings, not animals trapped behind walls. They swept floors daily, even if dust settled again within hours. They braided their daughters' hair in the mornings, the simple act of touch grounding them in a world rapidly dissolving. Some lit Sabbath candles in secret, shielding the flames with their hands so the light did not spill out into the night. These moments offered a brief illusion of normalcy, like a heartbeat echoing in a world that was trying to silence it. Still, danger lurked everywhere. German and local police patrolled the ghetto, their boots clicking sharply on broken stone. Women learned to recognize the sound instantly, the distinctive rhythm of authority approaching. When they heard it, they pulled children close, shushing them, urging them to stay hidden. The patrols brought terror. They conducted sudden raids, searching for smuggled food or valuables. They beat men in the street. They humiliated women. That constant threat hung in the air like a storm cloud, darkening every corner of ghetto life. Smuggling became the only real means of survival. Thin children squeezed through cracks in a wall, their small bodies perfect for slipping through spaces adults couldn't fit. Women stood anxiously by windows, waiting for their children to return with bread, potatoes, or even a handful of flour hidden beneath their shirts. Every minute felt like an eternity. Every approaching footstep could be salvation or catastrophe. The fear was so sharp it felt like a knife pressed against the throat, but mothers had no choice. Hunger was its own executioner. Women also tried to create a semblance of education for their children. Secret schools were organized in cramped living rooms. Girls and boys sat cross-legged on floors, listening as teachers whispered lessons in Yiddish, Hebrew, or Polish. The smell of chalk mixed with the scent of damp walls. These makeshift classrooms were dimly lit by oil lamps, their flickering light casting shadows that seemed to sway with every breath. In these quiet hours, children were reminded that their minds still mattered, that their futures had not yet been stolen, even if everything around them said otherwise. News from outside the walls arrived in fragments. Women gathered near gaps in the barricades, listening to whispers from smugglers or bribe guards. Some said Jews in other cities were facing the same fate. Others said deportations were happening far away. Rumors spread like wildfire, none fully trusted, all terrifying. The uncertainty was almost worse than the danger. Not knowing who to believe or what awaited them on the other side of the walls gnawed at their spirits. The emotional toll deepened with each passing week. Women felt shame, anger, disbelief, grief, often all at once. Some stood at windows and traced the outline of the wall with their eyes, wondering how such barriers could rise so quickly around their lives. Others broke down silently at night, their tears absorbed by pillows that smelled faintly of dampness and dust. Daughters watched their mothers carefully, sensing the weight of responsibility shifting onto them. Grandmothers whispered prayers under their breath, their voices trembling like thin threads woven into the fabric of the ghetto. Hope flickered, sometimes bright, sometimes faint. Some women clung to the belief that the war would end soon, that the walls would come down, that life would return. Others saw the truth more clearly. The ghettos were not temporary. They were tools, tools of control, tools of humiliation, tools of destruction. But even those who understood the danger rarely spoke of it. Speaking made it real. And reality, inside these walls, was unbearable. The first winter in the ghetto hit with a brutality that felt almost personal. Snow gathered on window ledges, turning gray from soot and smoke. The cold seeped through cracks in the walls, through thin blankets, through layers of clothing. Women pressed their children close at night, trying to share their body heat. Breath turned to frost. Water froze in buckets. Hunger and cold combined into a torment that lingered beneath the skin. And yet, even then, life persisted. Women traded goods in small, secret markets. They whispered jokes to keep spirits alive. They hid precious scraps of food for their children. They mended torn clothes with thread so thin it was barely visible. Their resilience was not loud or heroic. It was quiet, steady, born from a determination that refused to be extinguished. But the walls were tightening. Rules multiplied. Patrols increased. Food dwindled. Disease spread. Rumors darkened. Something worse was coming. Something that would make starvation seem merciful. The ghetto was no longer just a place of confinement. It was becoming a place of death. And women, who had already carried their families through invasion and isolation, now braced themselves for the unthinkable. The moment when the walls would not only trap them, but begin to crush everything inside. Chapter 4: Mothers of Survival. Holding families together in the ghettos. The first screams usually came before sunrise, rising through the narrow ghetto streets like a warning carried by the wind. It might be a mother waking to find her child's fever had spiked during the night. It might be a family discovering a loved one who hadn't survived the cold. It might simply be the echo of despair from another apartment, drifting through thin walls. But every morning began with the same truth. Inside the ghetto, survival was a test, and women were the ones holding the fragile pieces of life together, even as everything around them was designed to break. For Jewish women, these days felt like walking a tightrope stretched across a chasm, with hunger on one side and terror on the other. Every step required careful thought. Every breath carried the weight of responsibility. From the moment they opened their eyes until the moment exhaustion pulled them into restless sleep, they made decisions that determined whether their families would survive another day. They moved through cramped apartments with quiet urgency, their bodies thin, their faces pale from hunger, their eyes sharp with the determination of someone who could not afford to collapse. Mornings began in darkness because fuel was scarce and lamps were rationed. Women fumbled through the cold with numb fingers, tried to light stoves with scraps of wood or bits of coal gathered from courtyards. The smell of burning debris, wood, paper, even fabric, filled the air, stinging the eyes and coating the walls in a film of soot. Pots rattled as women prepared whatever food they had managed to secure the day before. Sometimes it was a few potatoes, sometimes a slice of bread, sometimes nothing. Hunger became a constant companion, a silent, sharp presence that pressed against the ribs and whispered of despair. But mothers hid their hunger. They learned to lie with ease when their children asked if they had eaten. Yes, of course, they would say, their voices soft but steady. They broke off pieces of bread and pretended to take bites when little eyes were watching. They pushed bowls away, claiming they weren't hungry, even as their stomachs twisted in pain. Their bodies grew thin, their cheeks hollowed, their skin sallow, but their spirits remained anchored by the fierce instinct to protect. To feed their families, many women turned to the dangerous world of smuggling. The ghetto walls were never perfectly sealed, and smugglers, often children, squeezed through cracks or climbed over hidden sections. Mothers would wake their children before dawn, whisper instructions with trembling lips, and hand them coins or a small piece of jewelry to barter with. The streets outside the walls were patrolled by guards with rifles, and being caught could mean beating or death. The risk was unbearable, but hunger was worse. Women waited by windows, gripping the edge of the sill so tightly their knuckles whitened, praying to hear their child's footsteps returning instead of a soldier's boots. Women who couldn't rely on smuggling turned to bartering. They gathered in dim courtyards or in cramped rooms lit by a single candle, their voices hushed. A handkerchief might be traded for a potato, a pair of worn shoes for a handful of flour, a wedding ring for a loaf of bread. Items once treasured became currency. Objects filled with memories, baby blankets, silver spoons, letters from loved ones, were exchanged for something far more urgent: calories to keep a child alive for one more day. Despite the constant struggle, women still fought to maintain a semblance of order and dignity. They swept the floors daily, even if dust settled minutes later. They patched clothes with thread pulled from old garments. They washed their children with buckets of cold water, rubbing their skin until it turned pink for friction. Cleanliness was an act of defiance, a way of saying that even in this place, humanity would not be erased. The air inside these rooms smelled of soap, damp fabric, and determination. Women were also the healers of the ghetto, tending to the sick with whatever they could find. Medicine was nearly impossible to obtain, so mothers used home remedies passed down through generations. Onion slices placed on the chest for coughs, cloth soaked in warm water for fever, garlic, when available, believed to ward off sickness. They tore strips from bed sheets to make bandages. They sat beside feverish children, wiping their foreheads with trembling hands, listening to the rasp of labored breath like a knife sliding slowly across their hearts. As typhus swept through the ghetto, women became its frontline defenders. They searched their children's hair for lice, their fingers moving with desperate precision. They boiled clothes when they could, filling rooms with hot steam and the sharp scent of detergent. They watched their children's every movement, terrified of the small signs: a persistent cough, a shiver that wasn't caused by the cold, the glassy look in the eyes that signaled infection. They learned to fear silence, because silence in the ghetto often meant death. The ghetto streets themselves were a terrifying place, but women ventured into them daily because they had no choice. The smell of decay clung to the air, mixed with sewage, smoke, and the acrid scent of German vehicles. Bodies sometimes lay in the streets, covered hastily with cloth until burial crews arrived. Children stepped around them with a chilling familiarity. Women walked past with eyes fixed forward, because looking too long meant letting the horror take root inside their minds. They saved their tears for moments when no one else could see. The Judenrat, the Jewish council forced by the Germans to administer the ghetto, often demanded unpaid labor. Women scrubbed streets, cleaned latrines, shoveled snow, and hauled heavy buckets of water. They did this while hungry, exhausted, and afraid. Their hands cracked from cold, their backs ached, but they pushed on because refusing meant punishment. Many worked knowing their efforts did nothing to improve their lives. The ghetto was still shrinking, food was still scarce, danger was still everywhere. Even in these conditions, women nurtured the bonds that made survival possible. Neighbors shared food when they had enough. Grandmothers told stories to distract children from hunger. Women supported one another during moments of collapse, gathering around a crying mother like a protective circle. In the darkest hours, this sense of community became a lifeline. A bowl of soup given to a neighbor was more than charity. It was a defiance of Nazi intent. It was the stubborn insistence that compassion could survive even here. Despite exhaustion and fear, mothers fought to give their children something resembling childhood. They told bedtime stories in whispers, their voices carrying just enough imagination to transport young minds beyond the walls. They made toys from scraps, dolls from rags, balls from rolled newspaper, small animals carved from wood. They encouraged their children to play quietly in courtyards, their laughter a brief, fragile melody that pierced through the gloom. These moments of innocence were rare, but they mattered. They reminded everyone that the Nazis had not yet won. Women also became the keepers of memory, passing down traditions even as the world collapsed. They recited prayers with their children, lit candles whenever possible, and told them about life before the war, not to cause pain, but to maintain identity. Culture became a spark in the darkness. Mothers whispered Hebrew songs into their children's ears, the notes soft and trembling. They celebrated holidays with crumbs instead of feasts, telling stories instead of cooking meals. The rituals were small, often improvised, but each one was an act of preservation. Some women found strength in resistance. They joined underground networks, smuggling messages, food, or ammunition. They carried information in hidden pockets, sewn into skirts. They memorized German patrol schedules. They hid fugitives in their homes, risking execution for the sake of strangers. Women who had once lived quiet, ordinary lives now moved through the ghetto like shadows, their courage burning brighter than their fear. But rebellion came in many forms. Some mothers tore down propaganda posters. Others wrote secret diaries, wanting the world to know what happened behind the walls. Some stood up to German soldiers, knowing the consequences, yet refusing to cower. They held on to dignity with a fierceness that defied the cruelty around them. Even funerals were dangerous. Women wrapped the dead in whatever cloth they could find and carried them to overcrowded cemeteries, their footsteps heavy with grief. The air around these burial grounds carried the scent of cold earth and sorrow. Mothers whispered prayers over tiny graves where children had been laid to rest, their tears falling on a soil that seemed to absorb despair. Yet even in death, ceremony mattered. It was the only way to honor lives the world was trying to erase. As months passed, the ghetto tightened. More families were forced in. The walls grew higher. The rations shrank further. Women watched their husbands weaken, their parents wither, their children's faces grow thin and pale. The nights became especially brutal, quiet except for the distant crack of gunfire or the coughs of the sick. Women lay awake, listening to the rhythm of breathing around them, terrified to hear one breath too few. They learned to recognize the sound of starvation. The hollow, slow footsteps, the faintness in the voice, the eyes that seemed to retreat into the skull. These signs became hauntingly familiar. Women fought against them with every ounce of strength. They begged, bartered, schemed, smuggled, cooked, cared, and lied to keep hope alive. Their bodies weakened, but their will hardened. The weight of knowing that their children depended on them was both a source of power and an unbearable burden. Mothers often sacrificed the very things they needed most: warmth, sleep, food, health. They moved through each day with a numbness that protected them from collapsing. They fought not because they believed survival was likely, but because they refused to surrender their children to fate. Through the freezing winters and sweltering summers, through hunger, disease, and terror, women built invisible scaffolding around their families, structures made of determination, love, and an unyielding refusal to give in. They held up entire households with hands that trembled but never stopped moving. They were the heartbeat of the ghetto. But even as they fought to maintain life inside the walls, new orders were being prepared outside. Orders that would tear apart everything they had worked so desperately to hold together. Soon, German officials would arrive with lists, trucks, and guns. Soon, women would face choices more devastating than hunger. Soon, the ghetto would move from slow starvation to something far worse. The moment when the gates opened again would not bring freedom, only trains. And women, who had carried their families through the darkness, would soon stand at the edge of a new nightmare none of them could yet imagine. Chapter 5: Hunger, Disease, and Desperation. The Slow Starvation of Women. It began quietly, almost invisibly, like a shadow stretching across a room as the sun goes down. Women felt the change before anyone said the word starvation. It was the way bread, once a daily comfort, became a distant memory. It was the way children began waking in the night with dry mouths and trembling limbs. It was the way the body grew cold, even under blankets. Hunger did not arrive with a scream. It slipped into the ghetto like a thief, and soon it stole everything. For many women, the first sign was the ration lines. They grew longer by the week, curling around corners like desperate serpents. Mothers would join the line before dawn, when the air was damp and heavy with the chill of the night. They stood shoulder to shoulder with other women, ankles aching, stomachs twisting, clutching ration cards as if they were made of gold. The smell of unwashed bodies, damp clothing, and nearby refuse mixed into a thick haze that lingered over the crowd. Some fainted where they stood. Others leaned forward with elbows on knees, too weak to support their own weight. Yet they remained. Leaving the line meant losing the chance at a handful of flour or a piece of stale bread. When they finally reached the front, after hours of numb feet and stiff backs, the shop often had nothing left. A clerk would shake his head, shrug his shoulders, or simply point to the empty shelves behind him. Women stared at the bare wood, trying to comprehend a world where even crumbs were not guaranteed. Some wept. Some screamed. Others walked home silent, their shoes scraping weakly against the cobblestones. Their children would be waiting. They would have to explain again why there was no food. Meals became ceremonies of sacrifice. Mothers broke off pieces of bread, so thin they looked like slivers of paper. They soaked stale crumbs in water to soften them. They made soup from potato peels, cabbage cores, or anything remotely edible. A pot simmering on a stove filled the room with an aroma that was both hopeful and heartbreaking. The illusion of abundance where there was none. Women often pretended to eat. They brought spoons to their lips, but never swallowed, waiting until their children were distracted before emptying their own portions back into the pot. One woman later wrote that she forgot what it felt like to be full. Hunger became a permanent sensation, a sixth sense, a pulse. It blurred vision. It made legs tremble. It caused strange dreams filled with tables overflowing with food, only for women to wake to cold air and the sound of their stomachs growling. Even the smell of cooking, a rare smell in the ghetto, made people dizzy. Mothers sometimes stood near those smells, inhaling deeply, letting the scent give them a moment of imaginary nourishment. Children suffered most visibly. Their arms thinned. Their faces sank inward. They developed a look, a hollow, glassy stare that doctors in the ghetto came to recognize as a sign of advanced malnutrition. Women watched their children's bodies change, each rib revealing itself more clearly through the skin. Mothers tried to hide their own fear, offering forced smiles while holding their children close, their hands trembling as they brushed hair from tiny foreheads. Disease followed hunger like a shadow. Typhus spread rapidly through the ghetto, carried by lice that thrived in the overcrowded apartments. Women became obsessed with searching for lice, spending hours combing through their children's hair, their fingers trembling as they crushed each insect between their nails. The smell of kerosene, used to sterilize combs, filled many ghetto kitchens, mingling with the damp smell of mold on the walls. Sickness made everything harder. Coughs echoed through hallways day and night, dry and sharp, like stones being scraped together. Feverish children felt hot to the touch, their skin burning while their bodies shivered uncontrollably. Mothers pressed cold cloths to their children's foreheads, but water was scarce. They whispered prayers. They begged God to spare their families. They begged the universe for just one piece of medicine, one vial, one miracle. Doctors tried to help, but supplies were nearly non-existent. Women often brought their sick children to clinics only to find long lines of others waiting. The clinic smelled of sweat, bleach, and despair. Mothers held their children's thin hands, watching their chests rise and fall in shallow breaths, hoping the doctor would find a way to cure them. But the doctors themselves were starving. Their faces were gaunt. Their hands shook. Their voices trembled when they had to say the words no mother wanted to hear. Many women became nurses without training. They cleaned wounds with boiled water. They fought infection with torn strips of cloth. They massaged trembling limbs. They slept lightly, listening for changes in breathing. The sound of a child's wheezing haunted them more than any German soldier's shout. The streets of the ghetto revealed the truth of starvation more brutally than any statistic. Bodies lay covered with rags on sidewalks, their limbs stiff in unnatural positions. Women stepped around them with tears burning in their eyes, clutching their children's hands tighter. The smell of decay, sweet and sour and unbearable, drifted through the air. Burial crews, themselves starving, moved slowly through the streets, pushing carts that rattled over uneven stones. Women heard the soft thud of bodies being lifted, felt a wave of nausea from the smell, and looked away. Their hearts hardened not from cruelty, but from necessity. To survive, they had to focus only on keeping their families alive. If they felt every death, every loss, every tragedy, they would break. Some mothers began to notice small changes in themselves, a numbness spreading through their fingers and toes, legs that felt heavy, hair that came out in clumps when brushed. They recognized the signs even before doctors did. Their bodies were deteriorating. Their strength was fading. But they refused to slow down. A mother could not collapse. A mother could not let hunger win. Their children needed them too much. Water became a challenge, too. Wells were overused, the water cloudy, and sometimes foul. Mothers strained the water through cloth, hoping to catch dirt or worms. The fabric took on the smell of damp earth and rot. They boiled it whenever they could, but fuel was scarce. Many children grew sick from contaminated water. Mothers scolded them for drinking too fast, too much, too recklessly, but they understood. Thirst was nearly as cruel as hunger. Women developed new instincts. They smelled food from impossible distances. They sensed trouble before it appeared. They could tell by the sound of footsteps whether a patrol was approaching or simply a neighbor passing by. They learned to read German orders, even if they didn't know the language. The shape of certain words, the tone of printed text, told them whether something was deadly or merely restrictive. Survival sharpened their senses into tools of protection. The black market became the ghetto's heartbeat, and women were often its lifeblood. They were the traders, the negotiators, the risk-takers. They bartered jewelry, clothing, family heirlooms, anything that held value. One woman traded her wedding ring, a simple gold band worn smooth from years of life, for a loaf of bread and a handful of potatoes. She cried afterward, not from the loss of the ring, but from the relief of feeding her children. Women saw things they never imagined they would see. Once respected elders digging through trash heaps. Children fighting over wilted cabbage leaves. Young girls collapsing on the street from lack of food. Mothers sobbing over children they could not save. The smell of starvation became as distinct as the smell of smoke. A dry, acidic scent that lingered in the air and on people's skin. Still, women found ways to care. They shared small portions with neighbors who were worse off. They visited sick relatives, carrying whatever scraps they could spare. They told stories to their children at night, their voices steady even as their stomachs twisted in pain. They hummed lullabies. They braided hair. They held tiny bodies as tightly as they could, willing their love to be enough. Some women refused to succumb to despair. They formed support networks, secretly organizing soup kitchens, medical help, childcare groups. Their gatherings were small and hushed, hidden behind closed doors, but they radiated a strength that terrified the Germans far more than any weapon could. These women understood something vital. Collective care was a form of resistance. In a world designed to crush them, compassion became rebellion. But as weeks turned to months, mothers could no longer hide the physical toll. Their faces grew gaunt. Their movements slowed. Some collapsed while waiting in ration lines, fainting from weakness. Children watched their mothers decline with a sadness too old for their age. It was a reversal of nature, children being forced to understand adult sorrow, mothers forced to reveal vulnerability. Yet even at their weakest, women still put their children first. They saved scraps of food. They walked miles to find medicine. They tore blankets in half to keep their children warm. They hid their tears until nightfall, when the darkness could swallow their grief. Starvation attacked not only the body but the mind. Women described moments when hunger felt like a madness, a pounding inside the skull, an inability to think clearly, a fog that settled over their thoughts. They forgot words. They moved in slow motion. They feared they would lose themselves before losing their lives. But their love for their families kept them anchored. It kept them waking in the morning, standing in lines, bartering with strangers, cooking meals that weren't meals, fighting for scraps that kept their children alive one more night. Every day was a negotiation with fate. Women traded pieces of themselves, energy, dignity, hope, to gain a single step forward in a world collapsing around them. And then, slowly, whispers began spreading through the ghetto. Whispers of lists, whispers of names, whispers of deportations. Women felt something shift again, a coldness deeper than hunger, sharper than disease. Something worse than starvation was coming. The walls that had starved them were now preparing to consume them. And the mothers of the ghetto, already holding on by threads, braced themselves for the next horror, knowing instinctively that the fight to keep their children alive was about to enter its most terrifying chapter yet. Chapter 6: Smugglers and Saboteurs. Women who defied the ghetto walls. The first time she sent her daughter through the wall, the girl was so small she could barely squeeze through the gap. The space was jagged, lined with splintered brick and rusted metal, barely wide enough for a child's ribs to pass without scraping. The girl looked back at her mother before slipping into the darkness beyond the barrier. The mother whispered a prayer under her breath, her hands shaking even as she forced her voice to stay steady. "Come back to me," she murmured. "Just come back." Then the girl vanished into a world where discovery meant a bullet. Mothers learned to live inside that moment, the moment of letting go, over and over again. This was the beginning of the smuggling networks, and it was the moment Jewish women transformed from caretakers into quiet warriors. Smuggling was born not out of courage, but out of starvation. Hunger pushed women into impossible decisions. They had to choose between watching their children wither or sending them into deadly territory. German rations were designed to kill slowly. Everyone knew it. A woman might receive enough bread to fill half her palm, enough flour to dust the bottom of a bowl. That wasn't survival. It was cruelty stretched across days. So women looked at their children and decided they would rather face death with a chance at food than sit behind walls and wait for famine to claim them. The first smugglers were the smallest bodies. Children slid through cracks in the wall like shadows. Their thinness, a tragic byproduct of ghetto life, became their weapon. They wore layers of loose clothing to hide whatever they carried back. Bread tucked under shirts, potatoes stuffed into socks, sugar hidden in pockets sewn into skirts. Mothers stitched these pockets late at night, their eyes strained from working in near darkness, their fingers pricked from needles. The fabric smelled of sweat, desperation, and hope. Women coordinated smuggling with a precision born of necessity. They tracked German patrol patterns, memorized guard rotations, studied the wall for vulnerabilities. They knew the sound of a soldier's boots well enough to distinguish between the sharp click of a patrolman and the slow step of a civilian collaborator. They could tell by the tone of a dog's bark whether it had caught a scent. Their senses sharpened to knife edges. They lived by instinct and intuition, trusting that their bodies would warn them before danger rounded the corner. The wall itself was a living, breathing threat. Its bricks radiated cold in winter and warmth in summer. Barbed wire gleamed like teeth waiting for flesh. Women touched the stone with their fingertips, feeling for cracks, testing for weakness. They knew every inch of it. The loose bricks, the places where mortar had crumbled, the sections where the Germans had been less thorough. These places were mapped in their minds, marked not on paper, but on memory and courage. Smuggling routes changed constantly. 1 week a gap near a sewer pipe might be safe. The next week, a patrol dog might be stationed there. Women knew that predictability was death. They shifted patterns, switched couriers, varied times. Some went through basements connected to non-Jewish buildings. Others used dead-end alleys where sympathetic poles lowered ropes with food tied to them. Some bribed guards with jewelry, gold, or favors they never spoke of. Every route carried risk. Every choice carried consequences. Women often waited behind shutters or broken windows for their children to return. They counted the seconds, then the minutes, each one stretching longer than the last. Their hearts pounded with such force it felt like the sound must be echoing through the street. The smell of anxiety, that sharp, metallic tang of fear, filled their throats. When the child finally appeared, crawling back through the hole or slipping through a gate left ajar for one breath of time, mothers exhaled in relief that shook their entire bodies. They hugged their children fiercely, feeling bones beneath thin skin, inhaling their scent, dust, sweat, sometimes bread, as if to reassure themselves they were still alive. But smuggling was not only a children's world. Women became smugglers too. Some crawled through cellars so narrow they had to exhale just to fit. Others climbed walls with fingers scraped raw, their nails broken, their legs trembling. They wore dark clothing to blend with shadows. They moved at night when the sky was black and the moon was mercilessly bright. They carried sacks on their backs that cut into their shoulders, the weight of potatoes or flour, leaving bruises shaped like survival. There was one rule: never get caught. Because being caught meant humiliation, beating, torture, or execution. Women knew this. They saw the consequences. They heard the gunshots. They saw blood pooled on stones. They recognized the vacant stare of a child who had witnessed a friend shot for smuggling. They carried these memories like scars on their minds, yet they continued. Hunger made cowards of no one in the ghetto. Hunger made heroes out of ordinary people. Women also became couriers, a different kind of smuggler. They carried messages, forged documents, money, and underground newspapers between ghettos and resistance groups. These messages were tucked inside shoes, sewn into hems, hidden in hair braids, or memorized word for word. If caught, the punishment was immediate. But the couriers walked with calm faces, trained in the art of invisibility. Their footsteps blended into the crowded streets. Their expressions were unreadable. Their hearts raced, but their movements stayed steady. Many female couriers were teenagers, girls with pale faces and determined eyes who could pass for Aryan if they dyed their hair or wore their skirts a certain way. They learned to walk with confidence, to speak Polish with smooth accents, to smile casually at checkpoints. The smell of their own fear clung to them like perfume, but they hid it beneath layers of bravery. These girls carried weapons, cash, and intelligence. They slipped past guards with forged papers that whispered lies into Nazi hands. Their work was vital. Their work kept resistance alive. Not all women crossed the wall. Some worked from within, guarding those who did. They acted as lookouts, positioning themselves at windows, pretending to hang laundry while scanning streets for patrols. Others tapped on pipes, a secret code, to signal safe passage. Many mothers formed human shields, gathering in groups to block a guard's view while a child slipped through a crack nearby. These acts were small, quiet rebellions, but each one chipped away at the Nazi hold. Smuggling networks were built on trust, but trust was fragile. Women learned to judge character in seconds. They listened to the tone of a voice. They watched eyes for signs of betrayal. They shared information cautiously. Every word weighed against risk. One wrong decision could end many lives. Yet women formed bonds stronger than blood. Hunger united them. Fear bonded them. The need to keep children alive became their anthem. Food wasn't the only thing smuggled. Women smuggled hope. They brought back news of Allied victories, of German losses, of rumors that the war might not last forever. They whispered these stories to their neighbors, their voices trembling with the weight of possibility. Even if the news was uncertain, even if the victories were small, it kept people alive. Hope was oxygen in the suffocating ghetto. It was nourishment as important as bread. Women also smuggled identity. They hid sacred objects, Torah scrolls, prayer books, candlesticks, beneath their skirts or inside blankets. They protected culture as fiercely as they protected children. One woman risked her life to smuggle a violin out of the ghetto. Another carried a box of photographs that documented Jewish life before the war. The Nazis wanted to erase memory, and women refused to let them. Sabotage was another form of defiance. Women working in German-run factories weakened seams in uniforms, tampered with machinery, or purposely made flawed ammunition. They did this with steady hands and blank expressions, hiding their resistance behind masks of obedience. Their sabotage was subtle but powerful, a silent blow against the Nazi machine. Inside the ghetto, women also created underground kitchens. They pooled resources, shared ingredients, and cooked in secrecy. These kitchens fed the weakest, the elderly, the sick, the children who had lost parents. The smell of soup simmering in these secret rooms was the smell of rebellion. Even a thin broth tasted like victory when it came from hands determined not to let evil win. Some women became involved in armed resistance. They learned to shoot. They learned to make Molotov cocktails. They trained in basements lit only by candles, their shadows flickering violently on the walls as instructors whispered instructions. Their hands shook the first time they held a gun. After that, they did not shake again. The Germans underestimated women. They saw them as weak, helpless, unimportant. They were wrong. Women moved through the ghetto with a power that came from love sharpened into steel. They were the eyes of the resistance, the hands of the hungry, the heartbeat of survival. But danger grew sharper with each passing day. German patrols increased. Walls were reinforced. Smuggling routes closed. The penalty for being caught grew, even more brutal. Mothers sensed the tightening trap. They felt it in the heaviness of the air, in the way soldiers' voices grew colder, in the whispers that began spreading through the streets. Lists were being drawn. Names were being recorded. German officers were planning something. Something massive. Something deadly. The women who had risked everything to keep their families alive sensed a storm gathering beyond the walls. Darker than hunger, deadlier than disease. Soon, smuggling would no longer be enough. Soon, they would face choices even more impossible than the ones they had already made. Soon, the ghetto would be forced into confrontation with its final enemy. And the mothers, daughters, smugglers, saboteurs, the women who had kept the ghetto living, would stand at the edge of a nightmare deeper than any they had survived so far. Chapter 7. Love in a Dying World. Weddings, Birth, and the Will to Live. The first wedding after the ghetto was sealed took place in a courtyard that still smelled of smoke from the last bombardment. The bride wore a dress made from 2 sheets sewn together by her mother, the fabric thin enough that the cold seeped straight through it. The groom stood trembling, not from joy but from hunger, his cheeks hollowed, his eyes too large for his face. And yet, when the rabbi whispered the blessing and the small crowd gathered around them hummed the faint echoes of a song they all remembered from better times, something extraordinary happened. The world felt alive again, if only for a moment. In a place built to crush the human spirit, love became an act of defiance. Under the shadow of death, people still chose to live. Women were at the center of that choice. They stitched dresses from scraps, prepared tiny feasts made from almost nothing, and whispered encouragement to brides and grooms who could not imagine a future but dared to stand together anyway. A wedding in the ghetto was not a celebration of certainty. It was a declaration of survival. It was a statement that even the Nazis could not stop the cycle of life. Women planned these weddings with meticulous care, hanging sheets to hide the ceremony from patrols, lighting candles hidden in corners, humming melodies softly enough not to attract attention. The air in those rooms was thick with warmth, sweat, and hope, a combination potent enough to make even the starving feel full for a moment. After the vows, a small piece of bread served as the wedding meal. Sometimes there was even jam, a luxury beyond imagining. Women shared the last drops of alcohol saved from before the war, passing the small cup from hand to hand. They sang quietly, their voices trembling but steady. They clapped in rhythm, their palms stinging from cold and hunger. These weddings lasted only minutes, but the memories of them outlived the ghetto itself. Birth, too, continued inside the walls, though every pregnancy felt like both a miracle and a curse. Women hid their swelling bellies beneath layers of clothing, terrified that German officers would notice. Being pregnant in the ghetto meant being targeted during selections, being denied work, being viewed as unproductive, and therefore disposable. Yet pregnancies happened. Love blossomed in secret corners. in cramped rooms where families huddled together, in whispered conversations near windows cracked open for a single breath of fresh air. Desire did not disappear in the ghetto. If anything, it grew sharper, a reminder that these bodies, frail as they were, could still hold life. A woman giving birth in the ghetto faced conditions unimaginable in any civilized world. There were no proper medical supplies, no sterile rooms, no painkillers, no guarantee of water, let alone clean water. Labor took place on mattresses placed on the floor, the fabric stained with previous births or illnesses. Midwives, women with hands that had delivered dozens of babies before the war, whispered instructions while standing in rooms lit by candles that flickered in the slightest draft. The air smelled of sweat, fear, and the sour scent of suffering. Mothers gritted their teeth, muffling their screams to avoid attracting the attention of patrols. A single cry could bring danger. Childbirth became an act of silence. Yet when the baby finally arrived, tiny, red, wrinkled, crying weakly, mothers cradled them with a tenderness that cut through every layer of despair. They held the child close, inhaling the scent of new skin, feeling the soft warmth of life pressed against them. Tears fell, not just from the agony of labor, but from the overwhelming realization that in a place where death ruled every corner, a small heartbeat had defeated the darkness for one fragile moment. Women made cradles from drawers, lining them with rags or pieces of clothing. They wrapped newborns in shawls worn thin from years of use. They fed them with whatever they could, a few drops of diluted milk, broth from boiled vegetables if they were lucky, sometimes nothing more than warm water mixed with sugar. They sang lullabies in the softest voice imaginable, their songs trembling with love and exhaustion. Babies slept curled against their mothers' chests, listening to the shallow rhythm of breaths weakened by starvation. These tiny lives depended entirely on the strength of women who were already stretched beyond their limits. Pregnancy brought constant fear. Women worried about every sign, a fever, a cough, a sudden sharp pain. They worried about giving birth during a raid. They worried about being separated from their newborns during selections. They worried about infections that could kill them within hours. They worried about not having enough food to produce milk. They worried about their babies crying too loudly. Love made every danger feel larger. Every heartbeat felt like a countdown. But women also created moments of sweetness. They held small naming ceremonies in secret, reciting blessings under blankets to muffle the sound. They dipped fingers in water to perform rituals instead of using wine. They invited neighbors to share in the celebration, offering crumbs as symbolic feasts. In these ceremonies, the scent of hope was almost tangible, warm, fragile, fleeting, but real. The words spoken were soft but powerful, declaring that this child belonged to a people who would not vanish, even if their world was shrinking. Beyond weddings and births, women nurtured love in countless quiet ways. They repaired their husbands' clothes, stitching holes with thread pulled from old garments. They braided their daughters' hair carefully, even when lice made the scalp raw and tender. They made small gifts, a ribbon, a carved wooden toy, a folded paper flower, as reminders that beauty could still exist. Their touch carried messages their voices could not express. Fingers brushing a cheek meant, "I am here." A hand resting on a shoulder meant, "We will survive this." A kiss on a child's forehead meant, "I will protect you, whatever it costs me." Romance itself took new forms. Couples held hands under blankets at night, whispering memories of life before the war. They whispered dreams of life after, imagining homes with real walls, meals with real food, the quiet peace of a world without fences. Lovers met in stairwells, their breaths visible in the cold air as they shared stolen moments. Young people flirted in ration lines, their cheeks reddening not from shame, but from cold and excitement. These gentle gestures were rebellion too. The Nazis wanted to crush everything human, and affection was a form of protest. Love also meant sacrifice. Women gave up their food. They gave up their warmth. They gave up their jewelry, their clothing, their keepsakes. They gave up sleep to care for the sick. They gave up time to barter and cook and search for medicine. They gave up pieces of themselves, their health, their strength, their hope, to keep their families alive. And they did it willingly, fiercely, without regret. One young woman wrote in her diary that she married her husband not because she believed they had a future, but because she wanted to feel human one more time. Another wrote that the first time she held her newborn, she felt like the world outside had vanished for that brief instant. Another wrote that love inside the ghetto felt sharper than love outside, because every moment might be the last. Even in the darkest corners of the ghetto, women found ways to create warmth. They gathered in small groups to sew quilts from scraps, piecing together whatever fabric they had left, shirts that no longer fit, dresses that had been patched one time, too many, blankets worn to threads. The quilts were mismatched, chaotic, made from dozens of colors and textures. But when wrapped around a sick child or an elderly parent, they felt like armor against death. There were moments when love itself was bitter. A mother might watch her child grow weaker despite all her efforts. A young bride might lose her husband to disease only days after the wedding. A pregnant woman might miscarry because her body had no strength left. These losses were devastating. They cracked open wounds that never healed. Women buried these sorrows deep inside, speaking of them only in whispered prayers or diary entries that no one would read for decades. But even through heartbreak, women held on to love. It was not a luxury. It was not a distraction. It was a lifeline. Without love, the ghetto would have collapsed long before the Germans began their deportations. And yet, despite all these moments of tenderness, something sinister was creeping through the ghetto's streets. Women felt it in the way German patrols lingered longer than usual. They saw it in the way officers began taking notes in the courtyards. They heard it in the new orders posted on walls. Short, cold sentences that hinted at a coming storm. They saw it in the shifting behavior of the Judenrat, whose members seemed increasingly anxious, their eyes avoiding direct questions. Something was changing. Rumors began to circulate. Rumors of mass transports in other ghettos, of entire families being taken away under the pretext of resettlement. Women shared these whispers in kitchens, over boiling pots of thin soup, their voices trembling. A neighbor claimed her cousin's ghetto had been emptied in a single night. Another said she heard trains at the edge of the city. Another said she saw German officers inspecting the gates as if preparing them for something. Mothers clutched their babies tighter at night. Newlyweds looked at each other with fear in their eyes. Women stopped planning weddings, stopped preparing for births, stopped dreaming of futures. Love became quieter, heavier, more desperate. Something was coming. Something worse than disease, worse than hunger, a darkness deeper than anything they had endured. And the women of the ghetto, who had created life in a place built for death, felt the air shift with that terrible truth. Soon, love would no longer be enough to save their families. Soon, the ghetto's walls would shake under the force of the next phase of the Nazi plan. Soon, the shadow of deportation would fall over every doorway, and the mothers, daughters, wives, brides, and newborns, all the fragile, beautiful lives that had bloomed in this dying world, will be forced to face horrors that no amount of love could shield them from. Chapter 8. Mothers in Hiding. Saving children at any cost. The night she decided to give her child away, the ghetto was unbearably quiet. Too quiet. The kind of silence that settled over the rooftops like a warning, choking the air, making every breath feel heavier. She held her daughter close, feeling the tiny heartbeat pressed against her chest, memorizing the scent of her hair, a mix of smoke, sweat, and something sweet that still managed to cling to childhood. She knew that keeping her child meant death. Giving her away meant a chance, a gamble against the darkness closing in. And so, with tears soaking into the child's thin blanket, she whispered, "Forgive me," and began to search for someone, anyone, who might take her daughter to safety. Choices like this were becoming common. In a ghetto, love was no longer only about holding on. Sometimes it was about letting go. It happened slowly at first. Families whispered about actions happening in nearby ghettos, about children being separated from their parents, about entire courtyards emptied in a single morning. Women felt the shift before anyone said the word deportation. They sensed it in the way German trucks idled longer near the gates, in the harshness of soldiers' voices, in the new lists being drawn up by the Judenrat. Something was coming, something that made mothers clutch their children so tightly that the little ones whimpered in confusion. Women began to search for hiding places inside their own cramped homes. They lifted floorboards, discovering shallow crawl spaces filled with dust and the bitter smell of damp earth. They moved furniture to create narrow pockets between walls. They stuffed rags into holes to muffle the sounds of breathing. These hiding spots were small, dark, suffocating. A child could barely fit. But in the ghetto, even a few minutes of concealment could mean the difference between life and death. Mothers trained their children to hide with the precision of soldiers preparing for battle. They whispered instructions into young ears, their voices tight with urgency. Don't cry. Don't make noise. Don't move until I call you. Children learned to disappear in seconds. One girl practiced so often she could slip under a bed and make herself invisible before her mother even finished whispering her name. These drills became routine, part of the rhythm of daily life, as familiar as brushing teeth or saying prayers. The fear of raids never left the minds of women. They recognized the signs instantly, the sudden tension in the air, the echo of boots, the dogs barking at the gates. They would snatch their children, shove them into hiding, and then stand in the center of the room, trying to look calm as German soldiers burst through the door. The smell of leather, sweat, and gun oil filled the space as soldiers rummaged through drawers, overturned beds, and shouted orders in harsh German. Mothers answered with trembling hands folded behind their backs, doing everything in their power to keep their eyes from darting toward the hiding spots. Some children learned to stifle their own cries, even when soldiers were inches away. A boy once wrote about lying under a floorboard while boots stomped above him, feeling dust fall into his mouth as he struggled not to cough. His mother sat on the bed above, trying to speak normally as her heart pounded so loudly she was sure the soldiers could hear it. These experiences aged children prematurely. They learned the meaning of fear long before they learned how to write their own names. Still, hiding inside the ghetto was temporary. Women knew it. Hiding only stalled the inevitable. Word spread. The Germans were beginning to liquidate ghettos across Poland. Deportations were not temporary relocations. They were one-way journeys. Families who boarded those trains did not return. Mothers understood before anyone said it out loud. The ghetto was becoming a place where children would not survive. And so began the painful, desperate search for saviors outside the walls. Many women turned to the Polish side of the city, hiding in the shadows near the fence, seeking people they hoped they could trust. Some Poles helped out of compassion. Others demanded money or valuables, payment for a child's life. Mothers gave away wedding rings, family heirlooms, even the gold fillings pulled from their own teeth. They would have traded anything. Items could be replaced. Children could not. These transactions often happen in alleyways or backyards, the air thick with tension. Women held their children close one last time, inhaling their scent, memorizing the warmth of their small bodies. They whispered promises of reunion they knew were unlikely, but necessary. Some children screamed, not understanding why their mothers were pushing them toward strangers. Some clung to their mothers' skirts with tiny fists. Some went silently, sensing the gravity of the moment, even if they didn't fully understand the danger. When a child left the ghetto, the mother often walked back alone, her empty arms feeling heavier than they ever had when she carried her child. Women described the sensation as having a hole carved into their chest. They walked quickly to avoid breaking down in the street. But the moment they crossed into their buildings, they collapsed, the grief hitting them with the force of a blow. Neighbors heard the cries, but pretended not to. Sadness this deep was private, sacred, too painful to witness. Not all women could find someone to take their children. Some hid them inside the ghetto for months, in cellars filled with rats, in attics where the heat was unbearable, in abandoned buildings where dust coated everything. Women brought food in secret, crawling on hands and knees to avoid being seen. They sang lullabies softly, barely breathing the notes so as not to attract attention. The air in these hiding places smelled of mold, sweat, and desperation. Children developed quietness as a survival skill, moving like shadows. Women also created networks inside the ghetto to watch over children whose parents had been taken or killed. Older girls, barely teenagers, took care of toddlers, feeding them, bathing them, rocking them to sleep. They formed makeshift orphanages inside abandoned apartments. The rooms were bare, cold, and overcrowded, but they were filled with an incredible determination. Women brought scraps of food. They brought blankets. They brought love. These orphanages were fragile islands of humanity in a sea of horror. Some women joined underground groups that specialized in rescuing children. They forged birth certificates, baptism papers, and Polish identities. They dyed children's hair, taught them Christian prayers, replaced their Jewish names with Polish ones. They rehearsed these identities until the children could recite them without hesitation. A mistake could mean death for everyone involved. These lessons were taught in dim rooms with covered windows, the smell of ink and old paper filling the air as forged stamps pressed new identities onto fragile lives. There were also the smugglers who escorted children through the sewer system, a world of darkness, running water, and foul smells that clung to skin and clothes long after they emerged. Mothers held their children above the water, wading through filth with grim determination. Rats brushed against their legs. The fear of drowning mixed with the stench of sewage made breathing difficult. But at the end of those tunnels sometimes waited safety. Women endured it with the strength of someone who had nothing left to lose except the most precious thing in the world. Even more dangerous were the escapes over the wall. Women timed these carefully, observing guard rotations, memorizing the sounds of changing shifts. They dressed their children in muted colors to blend with the night. They wrapped cloth around their shoes to muffle sound. As they approached the wall, the cold of the bricks seeped through their fingers. They lifted their children, whispering goodbye even before the child reached the top. On the other side, someone might be waiting, or no one at all. Hope became a currency women spent until they had nothing left. There were also moments when mothers chose to hide their children during deportation actions rather than give them away. When the Germans entered the ghetto with lists, guns, and dogs, mothers shoved their children into hidden cupboards behind chimneys, under floorboards. They piled blankets or furniture to conceal them. They whispered promises through cracks in the wood. "Stay quiet. I love you. I will come back." Those minutes stretched into eternity. Women stood in lines, their backs straight, praying their children would not make a sound as soldiers stormed through their homes. Many mothers did not survive these selections. Their last thoughts were not of themselves, but whether their children were still breathing under the floorboards they had chosen. Some children waited for hours, sometimes days, before emerging, only to find their mothers gone, their homes ransacked, their world shattered. But some survived, and some found their children again. Against all odds, there were reunions, moments where a mother opened a secret door and saw her child's eyes staring back at her through the darkness. These reunions were filled with sobbing, shaking, uncontrollable relief. The smell of dust and sweat was replaced by the warmth of tears. Mothers pressed their foreheads against their children's, whispering gratitude into the universe for a miracle that felt impossible. Yet even these victories could not stop what was coming. The deportations intensified. The ghetto shrank. Streets grew emptier. Children became targets in the eyes of the Nazis, considered unproductive, burdensome, unnecessary. Mothers sensed the shift like a storm rolling through the air. They began preparing for the worst. They packed small bags. They hid needles, thread, matches, and scraps of food. They taught children to run when gunfire began. They created signals, a tap on the wall, a whispered word, that meant danger. They rehearsed escape routes. These preparations became rituals, carried out with the calm efficiency of people who had accepted that death was no longer a distant threat, but a daily possibility. The decision to hide or surrender children tore mothers apart. Some chose to keep their children with them, unable to bear the thought of separation. Others forced themselves to let go, believing that their children had a better chance outside the ghetto. Love became a battlefield inside the heart. Women later said that the hardest part was not giving their children away. It was not knowing. Not knowing if the Poles who took them were kind or cruel. Not knowing if the forged papers would work. Not knowing if their children were warm, fed, or alive. The uncertainty was agony. It burned through every hour of the day, every minute of the night. Mothers lived inside that ache, carrying it like a stone embedded beneath the skin. Some women left notes with their children, short, heartbreaking messages written on torn scraps of paper. Her name is Ruth. He loves birds. Please keep him safe. Tell her I love her. These notes became the last connection between mother and child. They were found decades later in orphanages, in attics, in pockets of clothes stored away. Each note carried a universe of grief and a lifetime of yearning. Women who kept their children inside the ghetto until the very end faced a different kind of nightmare. They ran with them during raids, hid with them during selections, starved with them during blockades. They pressed their children's faces against their chests to muffle crying. They shielded them from bullets, from beatings, from the sight of bodies in the streets. Their love became armor, fragile yet unbreakable in its determination. But the walls were closing in. The Nazis were tightening their grip. Deportations were increasing. The ghetto was shrinking into skeletal streets lined with ghosts. And women knew, deep in their bones, that the moment of final separation was approaching. Soon, hiding would no longer be possible. Soon, the Germans would come with final lists. Soon, the trains would arrive. And mothers, who had spent every breath fighting to keep their children alive, would face the most devastating crossroads of all: to run, to hide, or to hope for a miracle in a world that had forgotten mercy. The storm was now directly overhead, and the women of the ghetto braced themselves for the unthinkable. Chapter 9. Resistance begins. Women in underground movements. It started with a rumor, a quiet, trembling whisper that moved through the ghetto at night like a pulse beneath the floorboards. Someone said the Jews in Vilna were fighting back. Someone said a group of young people had gathered weapons, stolen from German soldiers or smuggled in from the outside, and sworn an oath not to be taken alive. Someone said the word resistance. In a world where death was certain and hope felt like a half-remembered dream, the idea of resistance was electric. It spread from window to window, courtyard to courtyard, kitchen to kitchen, carried by women who had spent months swallowing their terror and now felt something inside them ignite. For most women, resistance began long before the weapons appeared. It began with the smallest acts: hiding children during selections, smuggling bread through the cracks in the wall, keeping diaries that documented every atrocity. These acts were not recognized as resistance at first. They were simply survival. But survival in a world designed for extermination was a form of defiance. Little by little, these small rebellions wove themselves into a larger movement. Women were often the first to sense that the ghetto was changing again. They noticed the shift in patrols, the tightening of rules, the new hardness in the eyes of German soldiers. They heard whispers carried in the butcher shops, in the ration lines, in the dim hallways where women waited for buckets of water. Something was coming, something darker than the starvation that gnawed at the ghetto from the inside, something worse than the deportations that chipped away at families like constant blows from a hammer. Women felt the air thicken with dread, and so they transformed their fear into strategy. The first underground meetings happened in basements that smelled of damp stone and mold. The walls were so close that breath condensed into droplets on the surface. The rooms were lit by candles whose flames flickered with every heartbeat. Women sat on crates or crouched on the floor, their knees pressed together, listening as young men, many barely older than teenagers, whispered about organizing a resistance group. They spoke of weapons, alliances, escape routes. They spoke of the Polish underground, of partisan groups in the forests, of Soviet forces approaching from the east. They spoke of fighting. But the women in the room understood something the men didn't fully grasp. Resistance was not just about guns. It was about information, logistics, communication, and sacrifice. It was about the silent battles fought in kitchens and courtyards long before a single shot was fired. It was about courage, yes, but also patience and precision. So they listened carefully, then stepped forward with ideas of their own. Women became couriers. They carried messages between units, slipping notes into hems of skirts or hiding them inside loaves of bread. They memorized intelligence, so nothing incriminating would be found if they were searched. They changed appearances easily, a scarf, a different coat, a new hairstyle, transforming themselves into faces that disappeared into the crowd. Their footsteps were soft, their eyes sharp, their nerves coiled like springs. Being a courier was one of the most dangerous roles in the ghetto. A single mistake meant torture and death. But women often succeeded because soldiers underestimated them. German officers saw women as harmless, weak, frightened, unimportant. They didn't realize that the same women carrying buckets of water or standing in ration lines were also carrying stolen ammunition or coded messages. Women turned this underestimation into their greatest advantage. Young girls became especially vital. Many were Aryan-looking, blonde hair, pale eyes, features that allowed them to walk through the gates with forged papers and return unnoticed. They learned to speak Polish fluently, to cross themselves in the Catholic manner, to blend into the rhythms of the outside world. They wore new identities like masks, stepping in and out of them with seamless skill. One girl, barely 16, carried grenades hidden in a box labeled cookies. She walked past German guards who smiled at her, never suspecting the deadly cargo she held in her trembling hands. Women also became smugglers for the resistance. They brought pistols into the ghetto hidden inside milk cans, bullets wrapped in cloth, maps tucked into baskets of potatoes. They learned to disassemble weapons in seconds, hiding the parts in different places, so a full gun was never found. They risked assault, interrogation, and execution every time they passed through a checkpoint, but they did it anyway, driven by the knowledge that time was running out. Resistance groups inside the ghetto formed under different names: OB in Warsaw, FPO in Vilna, and smaller cells in Lodz, Krakow, Białystok, and dozens of other ghettos across Eastern Europe. Women joined all of them. They helped plan missions, study German patrol routes, and identify targets. They mapped the ghetto's narrow streets with incredible accuracy, knowing where shadows fell at certain times of day, where patrols never looked, where walls were thinnest. Nothing escaped their notice. Women also created networks to hide fugitives, partisans, escaped prisoners, resistance fighters from other ghettos. They transformed attic crawl spaces into bunkers, enlarged hidden cupboards, reinforced basements. They stored food, blankets, water, anything that might sustain someone on the run. The air in these hiding places smelled of dust and fear, but it also smelled of safety, temporary, fragile, but real. Some women provided safe houses outside the ghetto. They bribed Poles to allow meetings in barns, attics, or abandoned shops. They traveled between these places carrying resistance, newspapers printed in secret. The ink was cheap, the paper thin, but the words were powerful. They recorded massacres, warned about deportations, explained the true purpose of the trains. Women read these papers by candlelight, their eyes widening with fury and sorrow. They knew the Nazis were not moving people to labor camps. They were killing them. Many women joined the resistance the moment they learned this truth. Some women used their beauty as a weapon. They flirted with German soldiers to overhear conversations, gather intelligence, or distract guards while others slipped past. They endured the nausea of being watched, touched, spoken to as objects. They swallowed their disgust and smiled because the information they gained could save dozens of lives. They paid a price for this, emotionally, physically, spiritually, but they accepted it as part of the fight. Others used invisibility as their strength. One woman worked as a cleaner in a German administrative building. She moved quietly from room to room, sweeping floors while German officers planned deportations mere feet away. She memorized documents left on desks, then whispered their contents to resistance members that night. Her broom became her disguise, her silence her weapon. Not all resistance was violent. Some women resisted through culture, teaching children in secret schools, writing poetry that captured the agony of the ghetto, painting murals on hidden walls. These acts kept Jewish identity alive. One teacher held classes in a closet with 7 children squeezed together, the air hot and stale. She taught them history, Hebrew, math, anything that reminded them they were still more than the ghetto's prisoners. This was cultural resistance, and it was as powerful as any bullet. Sabotage became a crucial form of underground warfare. Women working in German factories made uniforms with weak seams, bullets that wouldn't fire, grenades that would malfunction. These small acts slowed production, frustrated German officers, and offered the resistance precious time. Women sabotaging factories risked immediate execution, but they kept doing it. They used their fingers as weapons, their nimbleness as sabotage, their knowledge of cloth and machinery as destruction. Some women smuggled reports to the outside world. Long, detailed documents written in cramped handwriting on thin sheets of paper. These reports described starvation, disease, deportations, executions. They were carried across borders, hidden in shoes, smuggled through forests, delivered to Allied leaders. It was women who ensured that the world could not say, "We didn't know." Armed resistance grew slowly. Weapons were scarce, training dangerous. But women learned. They stood in basements holding guns that felt heavy in their weakened hands, their arms trembling from hunger, but their eyes burning with determination. They learned to assemble bombs from scraps, to navigate rooftops in silence, to fight even when all hope seemed lost. Women played critical roles in the famous uprisings: Warsaw, Vilna, Krakow, Białystok. They built barricades, carried ammunition through burning streets, and smuggled wounded fighters into safe houses. Flames lit the night sky, the air thick with smoke, gunfire, and ashes. Women ran through courtyards filled with bullets, their skirts catching sparks, their lungs burning from the heat. They fought with the fury of people who had lost everything except their will to resist. But even before these major uprisings, women fought small battles every day. They refused to let German officers break their spirits. They refused to give up their traditions. They refused to remain silent. Resistance was not always heroic. It was messy, terrifying, exhausting. Women argued, doubted, made mistakes. They lost friends, lost family, lost hope, then found it again in the smallest things, like a note smuggled across the ghetto or a whisper of victory on the Eastern Front. They carried grief with them like stones in their pockets, heavy but grounding. As the deportations intensified, resistance became the only choice for many. Women realized that death in a fight was different from death in a gas chamber. One was a tragedy, the other was surrender. They refused to be passive victims. They refused to walk calmly into trains. They refused to let the Nazis decide the terms of their deaths. But the price of resistance was steep. German reprisals were brutal. Entire families were executed when resistance activity was suspected. Women watched neighbors dragged into courtyards and shot. They heard the cries of mothers begging soldiers to spare their children. They saw the aftermath of raids, blood in the streets, broken doors, bodies left as warnings. Every act of resistance carried the risk of catastrophic consequences. Still, women continued. They continued because they could not accept the alternative. They continued because they wanted their children to live, even if they themselves did not. They continued because they believed that a spark of defiance might one day ignite something larger. They continued because resistance gave them a sense of control in a world where everything else had been taken from them. The ghetto was becoming increasingly unstable. Deportations were emptying the streets. Buildings were falling into decay. The smell of death lingered everywhere, a mixture of rot, smoke, and despair. The resistance was running out of time. Women sensed this in their bones. Soon, the walls would close in completely. Soon, the Germans would attempt to extinguish every remaining life. Soon, the final battle would come. And women, smugglers, saboteurs, couriers, fighters, teachers, mothers, would stand on the front lines of that battle, carrying into it everything they had left. Their courage, their grief, their defiance, and the fierce, unbreakable belief that they were fighting not only for survival, but for dignity, for memory, for the right to exist. The storm was reaching its peak, and the women of the ghetto were ready to face it. Chapter 10. Deportations begin. Trains, tear-stained platforms, and selections. The knock always came in the early morning, when the ghetto was half frozen in silence, and most families were still wrapped in the thin, patched blankets that barely kept the cold from their bones. It was never a gentle knock. It was a pounding, heavy, merciless, echoing through stairwells and courtyards like the sound of fate arriving at the door. Women woke instantly. Their hearts jumped to their throats. Every mother, every daughter, every grandmother knew what it meant. The deportations had begun. It didn't matter how quietly people moved, how carefully they avoided windows, how many rumors they tried to ignore. When the Germans decided to empty a block, nothing could stop them. Women grabbed their children before the soldiers even burst inside, their fingers trembling as they pushed little arms into coats that were too thin and shoes that were falling apart. The smell of fear, sharp, metallic, almost sour, filled the rooms. It mixed with the cold morning air, with the dust disturbed by frantic movements, with the sweat already forming on the foreheads of those who understood what was happening. The soldiers entered shouting orders, their boots slamming against wooden floors, their dogs barking with an urgency that shook the walls. Women stood in front of their children, the instinct of protection as automatic as breathing. But the Germans had no interest in humanity. They dragged people from beds, overturned drawers, smashed furniture, and tore apart the few belongings left. Papers flew across the room. Pots rolled across the floor. A cracked mirror fell and shattered. Even those too sick to stand were pulled from mattresses. No one was spared. The courtyard filled quickly. Children clung to their mothers' skirts, crying into the fabric. Women whispered calming lies. "We will be back by evening. It's only for registration. Don't be afraid." But the terror in their eyes betrayed the truth. They knew where the trains went. They had heard the whispers about Treblinka, about Chelmno, about places where smoke rose from forests, and no one returned. German officers said the word resettlement, but that word tasted like ash in every mother's mouth. The march to the Umschlagplatz began. Women moved in slow, shuffling lines surrounded by guards. The air was cold enough to sting the lungs, and the streets smelled faintly of smoke, sewage, and the sour odor of unwashed bodies. Some women carried bundles of belongings. Others carried only their children. Most carried both, and all carried fear. The sound of dragging feet echoed off the ghetto walls like a dirge. Along the way, people collapsed, some from hunger, others from illness, others from despair. Women knelt beside them, trying to lift them, whispering encouragement, promising survival. But soldiers struck them with rifle butts, shouting for them to move. A mother tried to pick up her fainting daughter. A soldier hit her so hard she fell into the snow. She crawled toward her child, hands shaking, until another soldier kicked her aside and dragged the girl away. The mother screamed, her voice breaking into 1,000 pieces. Everyone heard it. No one could help. At the Umschlagplatz, the deportation square, the smell of terror was overwhelming. Thousands of people packed into the space, pressed shoulder to shoulder. Women could feel the heat of others' bodies even in the cold air, could hear the sobbing, the praying, the whispered goodbyes. The gravel ground beneath their feet was stained with dirt, blood, and tears. The walls around the square loomed high, trapping sound and despair. Guards paced back and forth like predators circling their prey. Selections began immediately. German officers stood in the center of the square, flanked by dogs and soldiers with rifles. They pointed left for those deemed unfit for labor: children, the elderly, the sick, mothers with infants. They pointed right for those who could work. The movement of the officer's hand determined who lived and who died. That single gesture had more power than any law, any prayer, any hope. Women watched that hand with paralyzing dread. When the officer pointed left, women sometimes begged. They fell to their knees, lifting their children into the air. "Take me instead," they pleaded. "Please, not my child." Their voices cracked with desperation. Some clutched the officer's boots. The soldiers beat them until they fell, then dragged them to the left with the rest. The sound of these moments, pleading, sobbing, the thud of rifle butts, hung in the air like a storm that never ended. Children were separated from mothers in seconds. A little boy was pulled from his mother's arms as she screamed his name, her voice hoarse, her fingers clawing at the soldier's hands. A girl barely 5 whispered to her mother, "Don't let me go," as a guard yanked her away. Infants were taken from women who held them so tightly that soldiers had to force their hands open. The screams that followed stayed in the walls of the ghetto long after those who cried them were gone. Some mothers tried to hide their children by binding them tightly to their backs beneath coats. Others stuffed them into sacks and pretended they were belongings. One woman wrapped her baby in blankets and pretended she carried a bundle of laundry. She moved slowly, praying her child would not cry. The baby stayed silent, sensing danger with the instinct of the very young. But a German officer noticed the shape beneath the coat. He ripped the child from her and tossed the infant toward the left group with a motion so casual it made women's stomachs twist. The mother collapsed, howling in agony. Inside the square, the smell of human suffering was thick. Sweat, fear, urine, blood. People fainted and were trampled because there was no room to fall. Women held children above the crush, their arms burning from effort. Grandmothers tried to protect grandchildren, even as their own legs buckled. The sky overhead seemed indifferent, a cold, pale blur that offered no warmth, no mercy. Then came the trains. The sound of the engines was unmistakable, a low, rumbling growl that vibrated through the ground. Women froze. Children clung, even tighter. The opening of the cattle car doors released a wave of stench, old sweat, excrement, death. The cars were designed for animals, not humans. They had no seats, no windows, no warmth. Just wooden slats, darkness, and the faintest cracks of light. Guards pushed people forward with rifles, barking orders. Women tried to shield their children from the blows, holding them close as the crowd surged. Hands grabbed at coats, sleeves, hair. Feet slipped on the icy ground. Children cried. Mothers shouted their children's names. The chaos became a single, overwhelming noise. Fear turned into sound. When women reached the train, they were forced upward into the cars. The doors were low, and many stumbled. Inside, the air was already thick. People were packed so tightly that most could not move their arms. Women lifted their children above their heads to keep them from suffocating. The wooden walls scraped against their shoulders. The floor was freezing. The smell was suffocating. People pressed together not for warmth, but because there was no space. The door slammed shut with a metallic shriek. Darkness swallowed them. Some women prayed. Some sobbed silently. Some whispered stories to their children, trying to soothe them. Some stood motionless, their minds drifting far away as a way to survive the trauma unfolding. A few clung to hope, thinking maybe the rumors were wrong. Maybe they were being sent to work camps. Maybe they would survive. But most knew. Most had heard the truth whispered through the ghetto. These trains went to death. Hours passed, then more hours. There was no water, no bathroom, no air. The heat of so many bodies turned the car into an oven, even in winter. Some fainted. Some died standing, held upright by the press of the crowd. Babies grew quiet from exhaustion, their faces pale, their breath shallow. Mothers shook them gently, praying for a response. Sometimes they received one. Sometimes they didn't. The train lurched forward, and women lost their balance, falling against one another. Children cried from the sudden movement. The wooden walls creaked. The wheels screeched. The journey had begun, toward camps the women could not yet fully imagine, but already feared. Inside the ghetto, the aftermath of deportation days was visible everywhere. Streets were empty except for bodies that had been shot during the chaos. The air was heavy with silence, broken only by the occasional sob of someone who had survived the selection. Women wandered like ghosts, searching for family members who had been separated. They found shoes, shawls, abandoned bags, but rarely the people they loved. Mothers who had hidden their children opened floorboards with trembling hands, praying to see small, frightened eyes looking back. Sometimes they did. Sometimes they found only darkness. The grief of those moments carved itself into the soul with a pain deeper than any wound. The ghetto leadership, forced by the Nazis to administer the deportations, grew increasingly desperate. Lists grew longer. Orders grew harsher. Women sensed that the next round of deportations would be worse. They felt it in the heavy stillness of the air, in the nervous glances exchanged in ration lines, in the way soldiers looked at them with cold, calculating eyes. They began preparing for the next wave. They created hiding spots. They taught their children to run. They bartered for information. They stayed awake at night, listening for the distant hum of trucks or trains. The entire ghetto lived in a suspended state, waiting for the knock that came without warning. And it did come, again and again. Each time it came, women faced the same impossible question: hide or run, cling or let go, resist or submit. There was no right answer. Every choice held mortal danger. Some mothers were separated from their children because their child made a sound in the hiding place. Others were separated because a neighbor betrayed them. Others because a German officer pointed left instead of right. Fate decided. Men with lists decided. Hunger decided. Disease decided. The world decided. And women bore the consequences. Each deportation carved deeper scars. Each train stole pieces of the ghetto's heart. Each selection tore apart families with surgical cruelty. By the time the major deportations ended, the ghetto was a ghost of its former self. Entire courtyards were silent. Schools that once overflowed with children were empty, their walls echoing with memories. Streets that once held lines of mothers and daughters now held only debris. Women walked through these streets in numb disbelief, recognizing places where their children once played and now stood no signs of life. The deportations were not over. Not yet. But women understood the fate awaiting them. The trains would return. The selections would resume. The wall would tighten its grip until nothing remained. And the women who had endured hunger, disease, fear, smuggling, resistance, and heartbreak would soon face the next stage of the Nazi plan, one even darker than the ghetto itself. For the trains had a destination where life was measured not in days, but in minutes. And the mothers of the ghetto, still holding their children's names on their lips, were being prepared, unknowingly, for the gates of the camps. Chapter 11. The Final Liquidations. Ghettos burn, families vanish. 1942 to 1944. The end did not come with an announcement. It came with fire. The first hint was the smoke rising beyond the rooftops, thin at first, then thick, black, oily, drifting over the ghetto like a shroud pulled across a dying body. Women smelled it before they saw it, a bitter stench that burned the back of the throat. It was not the smoke of cooking fires or burning trash. It was the smoke of buildings, homes, entire streets set ablaze. And once they smelled it, they knew. The liquidation had begun. The Germans had a method for destroying a ghetto. They starved it. They deported it. They crushed its resistance. Then, when it was weak and nearly empty, they returned with fire and guns to wipe away whatever life remained. Women felt the shift instantly. The air changed. The streets emptied. The silence deepened. And the sound of distant gunfire, sporadic, sharp, echoing, became the background music to the final days. For the women who were still alive in these ghettos, Warsaw, Krakow, Lodz, Vilna, Białystok, Lublin, and dozens of smaller ones across the east, the final liquidation felt like the world collapsing inward. They had spent years fighting hunger, disease, and terror. Now, the walls themselves seemed to breathe with the knowledge that everything inside was marked for destruction. Liquidation actions began at dawn. German soldiers, SS units, Ukrainian auxiliaries, and local police surrounded the ghetto. Women heard the rumble of trucks, the bark of orders, the clatter of boots on pavement. They pulled their children close, whispering instructions they had rehearsed too many times. Hide, stay quiet, don't move, don't cry. But this time felt different. This time the soldiers were not entering to conduct a selection or fill trains. This time they came with torches. Houses were set on fire one by one. Women watched flames crawl up the sides of buildings, licking the walls, bursting through windows with a roar that sounded like the end of the world. The heat was unbearable, even from a distance. Sparks drifted through the air like burning snowflakes. Ash rained down on women's hair and shoulders. The fire devoured everything: wood, furniture, memories, turning rooms once filled with life into glowing skeletons of blackened beams and collapsing roofs. Smoke filled the streets, thick enough to choke on. Women wrapped scarves around their faces, pressing children to their sides. The smell of burning would mix with the smell of burning clothing, burning paper, burning lives. It was a scent that would haunt them long after the war. Sweet, sickening, unforgettable. Panic spread like wildfire. Families ran through the smoke-filled streets, searching for hiding places or simply running from death. Mothers screamed their children's names. Neighbors shouted warnings. The sound of gunfire cracked through the air, sending people diving to the ground or scrambling into alleys. Women pressed themselves against walls, their hands trembling, their breath shallow, watching soldiers shoot anyone who tried to escape. Hiding places, once sources of temporary safety, became tombs. Mothers pushed their children into attics, into cellars, under floorboards. They squeezed them into chimneys and behind bricks loosened by years of decay. They whispered promises through tears. Stay hidden. I'll come back. But many did not return. Soldiers set fire to buildings knowing people hid inside. Women heard the screams from attics, turning into coughing, then silence. They saw smoke pouring from basements where families had taken refuge. They knew what the silence meant. In some ghettos, like Warsaw, resistance fighters rose up as the liquidation began. Women helped in every way they could, smuggling ammunition, carrying messages through burning streets, tending to wounded fighters in darkened cellars where the air was hot and hard to breathe. They soaked rags in water to cover the mouths of those choking on smoke. They tore their own clothing into bandages. They held the hands of dying boys and whispered prayers. But resistance could not stop the liquidation. The Germans came with tanks, artillery, flamethrowers. Entire streets became infernos. The sound of collapsing buildings echoed like thunder. Walls fell inward, sending waves of sparks into the sky. Women ran through streets where fire raged on both sides, their skin blistering from the heat, their children crying into their shoulders. They ran until their legs gave out, until they found a doorway not yet burning, until they found a momentary pocket of air not filled with smoke. The deportations continued alongside the fire. As buildings burned, soldiers forced families toward collection points, courtyards, lots, open squares. Women arrived coughing, their faces streaked with soot, their clothes singed. They were forced into lines, thin, trembling figures surrounded by flames on all sides. Behind them, the ghetto crumbled. Ahead of them, cattle cars waited. The last deportations were the cruelest. Women were separated from men, children from mothers, old from young. The selections were fast and brutal. A child might be torn away from his mother's arms with a single gesture of the officer's hand. A girl of 12 might be told to step aside with the adults because she looked too thin to work. A mother might be deemed fit for labor, but her child deemed unfit. The soldiers did not care about bonds, about love, about humanity. They pointed left or right with the indifference of someone sorting objects, not people. Women begged. They pleaded with soldiers, falling to their knees, lifting their hands in desperate gestures of grief. They tried to barter with jewelry that had survived the years of starvation. They offered themselves in exchange for their children. But the soldiers brushed them aside, indifferent to their suffering. A mother's love, so powerful inside the ghetto, meant nothing on the deportation square. Some mothers made impossible decisions. They could not bear to abandon their children, so they stepped to the left voluntarily, holding their sons' and daughters' hands as soldiers tried to separate them. They chose death over loneliness, chose to walk toward the trains rather than allow their children to face the unknown alone. These choices were often made in seconds, but carried the weight of lifetimes. Inside the ghetto's final days, women witnessed horrors that seemed beyond human imagination. They saw neighbors shot trying to flee burning buildings. They saw children wandering alone, covered in ash, calling for parents who had already been deported or killed. They saw old women on their knees praying as flames devoured their homes. They saw the bodies of those who had chosen to jump from burning apartments rather than be taken. The streets became graveyards before the ghetto even emptied. Those who were captured alive were herded toward the trains. Women felt their legs tremble as they walked. Their lungs burned from smoke and terror. The air around the train platform smelled of metal, ash, and fear. They were shoved into the cars with so much force that some fell and were trampled. As the doors slammed shut, the darkness inside felt final. For women who remained hidden as the ghetto burned, the ordeal was different, but no less harrowing. They crouched in small spaces, behind walls, under debris, inside chimneys that still reeked of soot. The air was hot, suffocating, filled with smoke. They held their hands over their children's mouths to keep them quiet. They listened to footsteps outside, to screams, to the roar of flames consuming everything. Their hiding spots grew hotter, darker, tighter. Some prayed. Others simply closed their eyes and waited. When the Germans declared the ghetto clean, the silence that followed felt eerie. Nothing moved. Smoke drifted through streets lined with charred ruins. The smell of burned wood, burned belongings, burned lives lingered like a curse. Women who emerged from hiding found streets unrecognizable. Buildings they had lived in for years were now blackened shells. Courtyards where children once played were filled with debris. Bodies lay in alleys, some burned beyond recognition. But the Germans were not finished. Search squads swept through the ruins, dragging out anyone left alive. Women who had survived fire and starvation were forced from the rubble at gunpoint. They stumbled into the open, blinking against the harsh light, their clothes scorched, their faces streaked with soot. Some held children barely alive. Some carried the bodies of those who had suffocated in hiding. Soldiers showed no pity. They marched the survivors to the trains, completing the liquidation. As the last cars rolled away, the ghettos that had once held hundreds of thousands were nothing more than graveyards. The walls still stood in some places, jagged and gray, but they enclosed nothing. Silence settled over the ruins. Smoke drifted upward in thin columns. The final liquidation was complete. For the women who survived the burning of the ghettos, the journey onward was a nightmare worse than anything they had endured inside the walls. The trains were packed with people who had seen everything: fire, death, loss. Mothers held children who no longer cried because they were too weak. Daughters held mothers who could no longer stand. Grandmothers clutched the hands of strangers, whispering prayers in voices hoarse from smoke. They were headed to camps, Auschwitz, Majdanek, Treblinka, places where the very concept of survival was almost unimaginable. They did not know exactly what awaited them, but somewhere deep inside, they sensed the truth. The ghetto had been a slow death. The camps would be a faster one. Still, even in the final moments as the trains moved away from the smoldering ruins, some women refused to surrender the last pieces of themselves. They whispered stories to frighten children. They shared drops of water. They hummed songs that had survived centuries of persecution. They held each other's hands. They remembered names, faces, moments, determined that if they died, the memory of their loved ones would not die with them. The ghettos were gone, burned to ashes and rubble. But the women carried something with them on those trains, something the fire could not destroy, something the Germans could not confiscate. Memory, love, and the faint, flickering hope that somewhere, somehow, survival was still possible. The next chapter of their nightmare was waiting behind barbed wire. Chapter 12. Women forced into camps, from ghettos to extermination sites. The doors of the cattle car did not open gently. They exploded outward with a metallic scream, slamming against the sides of the train as a wave of cold air rushed inside. For a moment, the women inside didn't move. They were blinded by the sudden daylight. Their legs were numb from standing for hours, sometimes days, packed so tightly they could hardly breathe. But the world outside didn't wait for them to adjust. Shouts erupted, harsh, urgent, sharp, and dogs barked with a frenzy that made the ground itself seem to vibrate. Women stumbled forward, clutching their children, their bundles, their last remnants of life. Then, as they descended from the train, they saw where they had arrived. A place surrounded by barbed wire. A place where smoke rose from tall chimneys. A place where the smell of burning flesh hung in the air like an unforgettable, suffocating fog. Auschwitz, Majdanek, Treblinka, Sobibor, Belzec, names they had never heard before, but names that would define the end of their world. The first sensation was the cold. It cut through their thin clothing, biting into their skin as if the air itself sought to break them. Women shivered but held their children closer, whispering promises they no longer believed. The second sensation was the smell, a smell so strong and so distinct that it lodged itself permanently into the mind. It was the smell of death, sweet, acrid, thick, mixed with the odors of sweat, blood, disinfectant, and decay. It clung to the hair, the skin, the lungs. Women coughed as it entered their bodies. They didn't know that smell would never leave them, not even years after liberation. Guards shouted in languages many did not understand: German, Polish, Ukrainian. The women didn't need translation. The tone was enough. Hurry, move, obey, don't look back. Mothers clutched their children's hands tightly as soldiers with rifles urged them forward. Some children were too weak to walk. Their mothers carried them, even though their own knees threatened to buckle with each step. The ground beneath them was muddy, littered with discarded belongings from previous transports. Shoes, dolls, books, scarves, tiny jackets fallen in the dirt. Women recognized these items as signs, devastating signs, that the people who owned them were no longer alive. The first selection line appeared without warning. A row of SS officers stood waiting in front of the arrivals. Some had clipboards, others held batons. Behind them, dogs strained on their leashes. Women were pushed into a single file line, their hearts pounding so forcefully they could feel it in their throats. A tall, expressionless officer, sometimes it was Joseph Mengele, sometimes another, lifted a hand and pointed left or right. No explanation, no mercy. Women learned instantly what it meant. Left meant death. Right meant forced labor. Those with children were almost always sent left. The Nazis didn't want young children, or infants, or mothers unwilling to abandon them. Women understood too late. They held their children even tighter, sobbing, trying to shield them from the officer's gaze, from the terrifying, final gesture of his hand. The separations were instantaneous. A woman holding her baby was ordered left. Another woman, alone and still strong, was ordered right. She screamed for her child. She reached out. She tried to run back. Guards beat her until she fell to the ground. Another mother was forced to choose: leave her child to die, or go with them. Most chose to stay with their children in those seconds, their hearts breaking, but their resolve unshaken. If their child was destined for the gas chamber, they would not let them die alone. They would hold them, whisper to them, cradle them until the end. The women selected for labor were taken to barracks. The first stop was the shaving room. They were ordered to strip naked in front of male guards, their humiliation complete and absolute. Their clothes, full of memories, were thrown into piles. Some tried to hold onto a photograph, hidden in a pocket or sewn into a hem, but guards ripped them away. Their hair, long braids, curls, carefully cared for strands, was shaved off by women prisoners forced to work as barbers. The sound of clippers buzzed loudly. Hair fell to the floor in heaps, covering the tiles and mounds of brown, black, blonde. Women touched their bare scalps in disbelief. They felt exposed, violated, unrecognizable. Their hair had been a shield, a piece of identity. Now it lay on the ground like fallen leaves. Then came the showers. Sometimes the water was freezing, sometimes boiling. Sometimes there was no water at all, only prolonged terror. Guards shouted, laughed, mocked. Women stood naked, their bones jutting sharply, their skin pale, bruised, and cold. The air smelled of bleach and sweat. The floor was slippery. Some slipped and were beaten for being too slow to rise. After the showers, they were thrown rough uniforms, striped dresses that hung loosely on their bodies, itchy, filthy, crawling with lice. Their old clothes, the last ties to life before the ghetto, were gone forever. Numbers were tattooed on their arms. The needle punctured the skin repeatedly, leaving a permanent mark. Women watched as their identities were reduced to digits. Their names, the names their mothers whispered at birth, the names spoken in prayers, in love, in childhood, were erased by ink and cruelty. When the tattoo was done, their arms were sore, swollen, bleeding. They did not cry. They did not scream. Their tears had dried long before. Inside the barracks, the smell was overwhelming. Rotting wood, urine, sickness, unwashed bodies. The bunks were wooden shelves stacked 3 high. Women climbed into them with difficulty, careful not to disturb those already lying down. The mattresses were sacks filled with straw, often wet, often crawling with insects. At night, the barracks echoed with coughing, crying, nightmares, and whispers of prayers recited through chattering teeth. Women hugged themselves for warmth, their bodies pressed against the cold walls, their breath forming faint clouds in the dark. Days were defined by labor, backbreaking work that lasted from before dawn until after dusk. Women carried stones, dug trenches, hauled bodies, scrubbed floors, sorted through discarded belongings of the dead. Their hands blistered, their backs ached. Hunger gnawed constantly. Their stomachs growled so loudly it sometimes startled them awake at night. The soup they received was a thin liquid with floating fragments of something unidentifiable. The bread was stale, moldy, rations so small it was almost a joke. Women hid their portions beneath their dresses, trying to save crumbs for later, but hunger was relentless. Many fainted during work. If they fainted, they were beaten, sometimes beaten to death. The cold was another enemy. Women's feet swelled from frostbite, toes turned purple, hands cracked open, bleeding with every movement. Winter winds cut through the barracks, through their skin, through their bones. The thin fabric of their striped uniforms offered no protection. Some women wrapped their feet in scraps of paper or cloth, anything to dull the icy pain. But the cold was merciless. It killed slowly, silently, stealing strength one shiver at a time. Disease spread like wildfire. Typhus, dysentery, tuberculosis. Women coughed until their ribs hurt. They vomited from fever, collapsed from weakness. Lice crawled along their scalps, under their clothing, into their bedding. They scratched until their skin bled. The smell of sickness hovered in the air, thick and oppressive. The infirmary, if one could call it that, offered no real help. Women who went there rarely came back. They were selected for the gas chambers the moment they looked too weak to work. The gas chambers were the ultimate horror. Women did not need to be told what they were. They saw the smoke rising from chimneys. They smelled the burning. They heard rumors. They watched columns of people walk toward the buildings and never return. The selections became regular. Women lined up, their hearts pounding, trying to stand tall, trying to look healthy. A single cough could mean death. A stumble could mean death. A bruise, a limp, a sunken cheek. The Germans looked for any excuse. Some women survived selections by sheer willpower. They slapped their own cheeks before stepping forward to add color. They pinched their arms to make their muscles appear less weak. They leaned on one another to stay upright. They whispered instructions: stand straight, don't look afraid, keep breathing. They fought for each second of life. There were moments inside the camp where humanity flickered. Women shared scraps of bread. They gave away half their soup to someone sicker. They held each other when nightmares became too heavy to bear. They whispered songs from the ghetto. They told stories of children left behind. They memorized each other's names so that someone, somewhere, would remember. These acts were tiny, but they were defiance. They were proof that cruelty had not triumphed completely. Some women became part of resistance inside the camps. They smuggled gunpowder from factories, carrying grains under their fingernails. They passed notes. They had weapons. They helped orchestrate uprisings, like the one in Auschwitz's crematorium, where women played a crucial role, knowing they would die for it. Their courage was quiet, fierce, unforgettable. Others survived through luck, a slightly stronger body, a kinderguard, a companion who shared food. But every day was a battle. Every breath, a victory. Every sunrise, both blessing and curse. As the war turned and the Nazis began losing, conditions grew even worse. Camps were evacuated. Women were forced on death marches through snow, without shoes, without coats, without food. Those who fell were shot. Those who lagged behind collapsed in the snow and never rose. The marches stretched for miles, a moving line of suffering. Women leaned on each other, half carrying those who could barely walk. They whispered encouragement, even as their own legs trembled. Some died just steps from liberation. Some died just after being freed. Their bodies had endured too much. But some survived, scarred, hollowed, changed forever. They carried numbers on their arms, memories in their minds, ghosts in their hearts. But they survived, and the world would one day hear their stories, written in trembling handwriting, spoken in voices that cracked under the weight of memory. They would speak of the ghettos, of the trains, of the camps, of the smoke. They would speak of hunger, fear, humiliation, and loss. But they would also speak of love, of defiance, of sisterhood, of the quiet strength that kept them alive when everything else had been taken. Their survival was not just chance. It was an act of resistance in itself. For in places built entirely for death, these women found ways, small, fragile, impossible ways, to keep living. Chapter 13. Medical Torture. Women used in Nazi experiments. The women who survived the selections and the labor began noticing something strange long before they understood its meaning. Certain women were taken from the barracks at night, young ones, older ones, pregnant ones, twins. They were brought to a building on the edge of the camp, a building that smelled not of smoke or sweat, but of chemicals. The smell drifted through the air like a whisper of dread, disinfectant, alcohol, formaldehyde. At first, the women didn't believe the rumors. The human mind is not built to accept certain horrors until it has no choice. But soon, the truth became impossible to ignore. The Nazis were not just killing them. They were experimenting on them. For women in the camps, the terror of medical selections was different from the terror of gas chamber selections. Gas chamber selections were brutal, quick, and final. Medical selections were slow, predatory, calculated. The doctors, men in crisp uniforms, men with polished boots and soft hands, walked through the barracks as if they were browsing a market. They examined bodies with cold detachment, lifting chins, measuring limbs, checking teeth, observing scars. Women felt their skin crawl under the doctor's gaze. They felt reduced, not simply to a number now, but to flesh samples, objects. One name whispered through the camp more than any other: Mengel. Those who saw him spoke of his immaculate uniform, his gloves, his calm smile. He did not shout. He did not rush. He moved with a horrifying, deliberate ease, as though nothing in the world could disturb him. Women said his presence chilled the air around him. He looked at them as if the suffering that consumed their lives was irrelevant to him, as if he were a scientist studying insects rather than human beings. Women selected for experiments were taken to special barracks, blocks with boarded windows and locked doors. Inside, the smell was sharp and raw, a mixture of antiseptic and something far worse. The floors were cold, the beds were bare, and the silence was suffocating. These were not hospitals. They were laboratories of torture disguised in the trappings of medicine. Women who entered rarely came out alive. The sterilization experiments were among the first horrors inflicted on women. The Nazis wanted to find efficient ways to prevent Jewish women and Roma women from ever having children again. The methods were barbaric. Some women were injected with corrosive chemicals directly into their reproductive organs. The chemicals burned from the inside, causing agony so intense some women fainted from the pain. The smell of the chemicals lingered on their bodies, a bitter, acidic scent that reminded them of the violation they had endured. Others were subjected to high-dose radiation. They were strapped to tables under large, humming machines, their skin prickling as the invisible rays penetrated their bodies. They felt heat radiate deep into their bones. Hours or days later, their skin blistered, peeled, and cracked. Their hair fell out. Internal bleeding followed. Many died not long after. Those who survived often suffered infections, infertility, tumors, or lifelong agony. They were never told what had been done to them. They were never given care afterward. Pregnant women were targeted next. The Nazis wanted to study pregnancy under starvation, disease, and stress. Some pregnant women were forced into labor early. Some had their babies taken from them immediately after birth. Some were subjected to surgeries without anesthesia, cut open while awake, their screams echoing through the barracks, their hands gripping the sides of the tables with such force their knuckles split. The smell of blood filled the rooms. The cries of women begging for their babies haunted everyone who heard them. If the baby survived the birth, it was often killed in front of the mother, drowned, suffocated, or injected with poison. The mother was forced to watch. The cruelty was intentional. The Nazis wanted to break the women completely. Twins suffered even worse. Mengele was obsessed with twins. He saw them as the perfect specimens for experimenting on genetics. When a pair of twins arrived in the camp, even newborns, guards pulled them from their mother's arms. Mothers knew the moment their children were taken that they would likely never see them again. Their screams filled the air, but changed nothing. Twin experiments were methodical and monstrous. Children were measured, weighed, and photographed endlessly. Their eyes were examined. Their blood was drawn so frequently that their tiny bodies could not recover. Some were injected with diseases to see if both twins reacted the same way. Others had chemicals injected into their eyes to test changes in pigmentation. The chemicals burned like acid, leaving some children blind. Operations were performed without anesthesia. Bones were broken. Organs were removed. One twin might be killed, so the doctor could compare the organs to the surviving sibling. The cruelty defied every boundary of human comprehension. Women who were not part of the twin experiments, but worked in the infirmary, witnessed horrors they never spoke of aloud. They saw jars filled with fetuses, body parts, organs preserved in chemicals. They saw corpses stacked beside operating tables. They saw doctors taking notes with calm interest as women writhed in agony. They cleaned blood from instruments while trying to keep their hands from shaking. The smell of death clung to their hair, their clothes, their skin. Other experiments tested endurance. Women were forced to drink seawater to test survival. They were deprived of food for weeks while their reactions were studied. They were exposed to extreme cold, submerged in ice water, stripped and left outside in freezing temperatures to record how long it took for their bodies to fail. Their screams filled the night. Their frozen bodies were carried away at dawn. Some were infected deliberately with typhus, malaria, or tuberculosis. They were injected with infected blood, forced to lie in beds next to dying patients, exposed to fleas carrying disease. Their suffering was recorded in notebooks. Their skin was hot with fever. Their vision blurred. Their breathing grew labored. If they survived the infection, they were infected again, sometimes with increasing doses. Their survival meant more suffering. Roma women faced additional horrors. Some were forced into mass sterilizations. Others were used to test poisons, fed chemicals, or injected with insecticides to observe the effects. Their bodies convulsed. Their skin turned colors. Their screams grew hoarse. Their deaths were recorded with clinical detachment. Women selected for experiments lost all sense of time. Days blurred together in a fog of pain, fear, and exhaustion. They prayed for death. They prayed for miracles. They prayed for their families. They prayed for the world to remember them. The lack of hope was suffocating. The lack of mercy was absolute. Yet even in the darkest corners of the experimental blocks, small acts of humanity flickered. Prisoner nurses risked their lives to give women a sip of water. They whispered comforting words in Yiddish, Polish, Hungarian, Romani. They held hands of those dying. They smoothed hair. They wiped tears. These gestures were dangerous, but they were necessary. Sometimes women fought back. One prisoner nurse wrote down the names of victims, hiding the list under floorboards so the world would know who they were. Another smuggled out a bottle of poisonous injection fluid and replaced it with water, saving dozens of victims. A group of women in Auschwitz smuggled gunpowder from the munitions factory, grain by grain, hidden under their fingernails or in corners of their clothing. This gunpowder was used to blow up one of the crematoriums in a desperate act of rebellion. Women also resisted emotionally. They refused to scream when tortured, to deny the experimenters the satisfaction. They sang songs quietly to each other at night, songs from their childhoods, songs of faith, songs that reminded them of life beyond the barbed wire. They held each other as they cried, forming circles of comfort in rooms built for cruelty. But resistance could not stop the machinery of death. Medical experiments continued until the final days of the camps. Even when the Nazis knew the war was lost, they continued, desperate to finish their research, desperate to leave behind a legacy of cruelty disguised as science. They did not see the women as human. They saw them as data. When liberation finally came, many women who survived the experiments were barely recognizable as living beings. Their bodies were marked with scars, physical and invisible. They walked with pain. They bore lasting internal injuries. Many could never have children. Many lived with chronic illness, nightmares, tremors, and memories too painful to speak aloud. But they survived. And in surviving, they became witnesses. After the war, these women testified in trials, telling the world what had happened in rooms that smelled of chemicals and death. They described the needles, the knives, the cruelty, the cold detachment of doctors who violated every oath they had ever sworn. Their testimonies shook courtrooms. Their words forced the world to confront the truth. Some women broke down as they spoke. Some remained steady, their voices calm but filled with sorrow. Some could not speak at all but sat in silence, their tattoos visible, their eyes telling stories without sound. Their presence alone was a confrontation, a reminder of what hatred mixed with authority can do. The world listened. Slowly, painfully, imperfectly, but it listened. And those women, those who survived and those who did not, became the guardians of memory. Their stories became warnings carved into history. Their suffering was not a footnote. It was a testament, for they had lived through the darkest depths of human cruelty. They had walked through rooms where science was corrupted into torture. They had endured pain designed to erase their humanity. And yet, through it all, they protected something the Nazis could never take. Their will to survive. Their will to remember. Their will to make the world listen. Chapter 14. The Last Mothers. Women who survived through sheer will. The women who survived into the final months of the war did so not because they were the strongest or the healthiest or the luckiest, though luck, in the camps, took on a brutal sort of meaning, but because something inside them refused to let go. It was not a physical strength. Their bodies had long been pushed past the limits of endurance. It was something deeper, something fierce and unyielding, a quiet defiance that lived beneath the hunger, beneath the fear, beneath the exhaustion. They had been starved, shaved, beaten, humiliated, experimented on, and forced to watch the destruction of everything they loved. But they were still alive. Barely. And even in that near-death existence, they protected one another in ways the Nazis could never comprehend. By the last winter of the war, the camps were collapsing under their own weight. The Nazis were running out of supplies, out of manpower, out of time. Women felt the change not through hope. Hope was a dangerous thing in the camps, but through atmosphere. The guards were more violent, more rushed, more unpredictable. Selections came at odd hours. The food rations, once pathetic, now became almost non-existent. Disease spread faster. Rumors of liberation whispered through the barracks like ghosts, but the women had been deceived too many times to trust them. Still, their bodies reacted differently. Some women who had been on the brink of death found themselves suddenly fighting harder, breathing deeper, clinging more desperately to consciousness. They wanted to see the end. They wanted to see the Nazis fall. They wanted to live long enough to tell their children's stories, their mothers' names, their sisters' faces, because the world had to know what had been done. In the barracks, women formed small, fragile communities. They slept in clusters, pressed against each other for warmth, their bodies skeletal, but still generating enough heat to keep one another alive. They whispered in the dark, sharing memories of home, the smell of bread baking, the sound of children laughing, the warmth of a mother's hug. These memories hurt, but they also nourished. They reminded the women that they had once been human, that they had identities beyond numbers, beyond stripes, beyond the bruises covering their skin. Sometimes, women sang, quietly, so quietly that the guards wouldn't hear. Old lullabies, hymns, folk songs. The voices were cracked, thin, barely audible above the wind that whistled through the cracks in the barack walls. But the songs carried weight. For a few minutes each night, the barack became a sanctuary, a place where voices rose instead of screams, a place where the Nazis' cruelty could not fully penetrate. Survival depended on small acts, tiny decisions that built the difference between life and death. Women saved crumbs of bread and hid them in their sleeves, risking beatings if caught. They stole potatoes from nearby fields during work details, gripping them in their fists until their knuckles ached. They tore pieces from their own clothing to bind the wounds of a friend. They shared sips of water with the sick. They took turns sleeping, keeping watch for selections. They shielded the weakest women during roll call, holding them upright while guards counted so the infirm wouldn't be noticed and dragged away. Roll call was one of the worst horrors of camp life, and by the end of the war, it had become even more unbearable. Hours spent standing in freezing temperatures, snow soaking through thin shoes, wind cutting through the flimsy uniforms. Women fainted in rows, their bodies dropping silently into the snow. Others collapsed and never rose again. The guards showed no mercy. They shouted, beat, kicked, and shot those who faltered. But women held each other steady. They leaned shoulder to shoulder, hip to hip, keeping one another upright through the endless hours. The death marches began when the Germans realized the camps would soon be overrun by the advancing Allies. Women were forced to walk through snow, through forests, through villages, often barefoot, often with no food. The cold was fierce. Breath turned to shards of ice in the air. The sound of the marches was a haunting one. The shuffling of thousands of feet, the cries of those who fell, the crack of gunshots as guards executed the weak. Women supported one another in those marches with a devotion that defied the surrounding brutality. They wrapped their arms around those who stumbled, carried friends who could not walk, whispered encouragement when despair became overwhelming. They shared memories to keep their minds alive. They spoke of recipes, of poems, of gardens, of holidays. They rebuilt their humanity through words, weaving threads of the world they had lost into the frozen landscape they were being forced to cross. One survivor described how she and two other women made a pact. If one fell, the others would try to carry her until they no longer could. They kept that promise. For miles, they dragged one another through snow, their legs trembling, their lungs burning, their hearts beating in sync with a rhythm that defied death. And when one finally died, the others whispered prayers over her body before continuing the march. Love was the last thing they had left, and they used it to fight death itself. Inside the camps that were not evacuated, conditions deteriorated even further. Food shipments stopped. The crematoriums ran nonstop. Guards grew more frantic and unpredictable, sometimes killing prisoners for sport. Disease raged. Women grew delirious with fever. Their bodies were so thin that their bones pressed through their skin like jagged stones. Some lost their vision. Others lost their voices. But even then, they clung to one another. They shared memories and whispers. They recited prayers, even when they could barely breathe. Then, slowly the sounds changed. Instead of German commands, women began hearing explosions in the distance, artillery from the approaching Allies. They heard planes overhead. They saw smoke rising from battles outside the camp. They sensed the panic in the guards' movements. Something was shifting, something enormous. Women felt it in the air. Liberation was close, but not close enough to guarantee survival. They had seen too much cruelty to assume safety. They waited, barely breathing, as the world beyond the barbed wire moved closer. Days passed. Nights passed. Death continued, even as freedom approached. The final days were the hardest, because hope was dangerous. Hope could cause someone to relax, to let go, to stop fighting. Hope could kill. But liberation did come. For some, it came suddenly. Tanks rumbled through the camp gates. Soldiers shouted in languages the women did not understand. The guards fled. The watchtowers were abandoned. Women stepped outside their barracks, blinking in the sudden brightness, their bodies trembling with disbelief. For others, liberation came slowly, painfully. Soldiers found them collapsed on barack floors, barely alive. They carried them out, wrapped them in blankets, gave them sips of water. Women cried when they realized these men were not guards. Their bodies shook with relief. Their minds struggled to comprehend the sudden shift from death to freedom. Some could not celebrate. They were too weak. They died in the arms of liberators, tears still wet on their cheeks. But many survived, by miracle, by willpower, by the strength of bonds forged in hell. After liberation, the women who survived faced new challenges. Their bodies were ravaged. Their families were gone. Their homes destroyed. Many were unable to have children because of the experiments or the starvation. They carried scars, physical, emotional, spiritual, that never fully healed. But they lived. They rebuilt lives from nothing. Some emigrated. Some returned to their towns and found them empty. Some married. Some remained alone. But they all carried the memories. They all carried the stories of those who did not survive. They became the keepers of truth. Women testified in trials. They recounted the horrors of the camps in voices that trembled but never faltered. They wrote memoirs. They spoke in schools. They told their children and grandchildren. Their words shaped the world's understanding of the Holocaust. They refused to let the Nazis silence them. The last mothers of the ghettos and camps, those who had held children through starvation, who had shared crumbs of bread, who had stood tall during selections, who had walked through snow carrying others, became symbols of endurance, symbols of impossible survival. Their story was not one of heroism in the traditional sense. It was a story of love used as a weapon, of compassion used as resistance, of connection used as armor. It was a story of women who were not allowed to be human, yet somehow remained human anyway. They had fought starvation, disease, experiments, death marches, selections. They had endured the loss of everyone they loved. And still, they rose from the ashes of those camps with their memories intact, their dignity reclaimed, their voices ready to speak. Their survival was a miracle. Their strength was a testament. Their existence was a form of justice. And the world they stepped into after liberation would never be the same again, because these women carried within them the truth of what had happened, and they would ensure it was never forgotten. Chapter 15. Aftermath. Loss, silence, survival, and the memory of women. Liberation did not come with the triumphant joy that the world imagines. For the women who survived the ghettos, the selections, the camps, the marches, liberation arrived like a whisper, soft, confusing, unreal. Soldiers entered the camps with wide eyes and horrified expressions, their boots crunching over debris and skeleton-thin bodies. They spoke words the women could not understand, but their tone was gentle, their hands raised in gestures of peace. Some soldiers cried when they saw what remained of the prisoners. Some covered their faces, trying to block the smell of death that clung to every beam, every bunk, every breath of the wind. And the women, frail, hollow, trembling, looked at the uniforms and did not know whether to run or collapse or simply stare. The moment of liberation for most women was not a shout, but a collapse. Their legs finally gave out. They fell to the ground, unable to stand after months or years of forcing themselves upright through starvation and terror. Allied medics rushed to catch them. Blankets were wrapped around shoulders that were little more than bone. Cups of water were lifted to lips that had forgotten how to drink without trembling. A piece of bread, something so ordinary before the war, became almost too emotional to bear. Some women cried when they tasted real food for the first time in so long. Others vomited because their bodies could no longer accept it. Liberation was complicated. It was relief mixed with grief, safety mixed with confusion, life mixed with memories of death. The camps themselves felt haunted. Women walked through gates that had once been instruments of terror, their bare feet touching ground that still felt unsafe. They stepped into sunlight and squinted as though the world was too bright. Some grabbed the hands of strangers, holding on because touch was the only anchor left. Others moved in silence, staring at the watchtowers, the barbed wire, the smoldering rubble, the chimneys that still exhaled the ashes of their families. Liberation did not erase the camp. It merely placed a new border around it. The days after liberation were filled with chaos and illness. Many women were too weak to leave immediately. Hospitals were set up near the camps, makeshift medical buildings where doctors tried to reverse months of starvation. The beds smelled of disinfectant and damp cloth. Women lay under blankets, shivering even when warm, their bodies struggling to relearn how to live. Nurses spoon-fed them soup. Doctors measured their weight, their pulse, their temperature. Some women spoke for the first time in weeks, their voices cracking like old wood. Others could not speak at all. Trauma had wrapped itself around their throats. For some women, liberation came too late. They died in the days or weeks after the soldiers arrived, their bodies simply too damaged to recover. Survivors often said that these deaths were among the hardest to witness, not because they were unexpected, but because they came at the exact moment freedom finally arrived. The women who died after liberation became symbols of the blurred boundary between survival and loss, reminders that even freedom could not undo certain wounds. Those who survived faced a new, almost unimaginable question. Where do we go now? Their homes were gone. Their families were gone. Their cities were shattered. Their communities, once vibrant and overflowing with life, had been reduced to a few scattered souls wandering through Europe with nothing but memories and numbers tattooed on their arms. Women who returned to their hometowns found strangers living in their houses. They found synagogues burned. They found neighbors who looked away or whispered behind their backs or simply shrugged. Some were told, "We thought you were dead." Others were told, "You should not have come back." Violence awaited some women who tried to reclaim property. Fear drove many away a second time. Home was no longer home. Many survivors entered displaced persons camps, temporary settlements that smelled of canvas tents, smoke, and overcrowded humanity. Rooms were filled with bunk beds, families thrown together by chance. Women searched for relatives on bulletin boards covered with handwritten notes. The boards rustled with every breeze, the papers flapping like desperate messages from the dead. Women walked from note to note, reading names, dates, fragments of information. Some found sisters or cousins or neighbors. Most found nothing. The silence of those boards felt heavier than the loudest screams in the ghettos. Some women discovered they were the only ones left from their entire families. A survivor from Lodz once said, "I kept repeating the names of my mother, my sisters, my father, my nieces, as though saying them might bring them back." Memory became both comfort and torment. For these women, remembering was the only form of grief available. There were no graves, no funerals, no bodies, only the weight of names carried inside the mind. The emotional aftermath was overwhelming. Nightmares became a constant companion. Women woke screaming, drenched in sweat, gasping for air. The smell of smoke triggered flashbacks. The sound of dogs barking made them shake. The sight of trains filled them with terror. Hunger remained inside them, even when they had food. They hoarded bread under pillows. They stored extra portions in pockets. They ate slowly, silently, as if unsure the next meal would come. Their bodies remembered starvation, even when their minds tried to move forward. Relationships were difficult. Some women married quickly, seeking comfort, family, stability, a chance to rebuild what had been destroyed. Others avoided intimacy, haunted by shame inflicted in the camps or by memories too painful to share. Many survivors never spoke of what had happened. Silence became a shield. They carried their trauma quietly, hidden under smiles, under new lives, under the desire to protect their children from the darkness they had endured. Motherhood after the Holocaust was complicated and brave. Women who survived medical experiments often believed they could never have children. Some were right. Others discovered they could conceive despite everything. The act of bringing life into the world after witnessing so much death was both terrifying and healing. Survivors describe holding their newborns with trembling hands, smelling their skin, feeling their warmth, and thinking, life continues. But motherhood was also filled with fear. Some women watched their babies breathe at night, checking repeatedly to be sure they were alive. Loss had carved too deep a mark. Some women were unable to conceive at all due to forced sterilizations or injuries from experiments. Their grief was lifelong, a quiet, unspoken mourning for the children they would never have, the future that had been stolen from them with needles and chemicals and cold metal instruments. Yet many of these women became adoptive mothers or community mothers, raising children of relatives or orphans of the war. Their love found new forms, new pathways. Psychological wounds were harder to heal. Survivors carried guilt, survivors' guilt, so heavy it bent their spirits. They asked why they had lived when so many others had died. They felt unworthy of the life they reclaimed. Women wondered if they should have fought harder, hidden better, sacrificed more. But they forgot one thing. They had already done the impossible. They had survived the largest system of human destruction the world had ever seen. They had resisted not by fighting with weapons, but by fighting to breathe, to protect, to remember. In the years after the war, some women testified in trials. They sat in courtrooms facing the men who had tortured them, the men who had murdered their families, the men who had turned medicine into murder. Their voices shook, but they spoke. They described the ghettos, the smoke, the selections, the experiments. They recounted the screams, the hunger, the trembling hands of mothers forced to let go of their children. They told the truth. Their truth became evidence. Their memories became justice. Others refused to speak. Their trauma was locked inside, too painful to open. They built new lives and tried to bury the past. But the past lived inside them. It appeared in quiet moments, while washing dishes, while looking at the sky, while holding a grandchild. Pain has a way of lingering, even in the brightest rooms. As decades passed, survivors began to age. Their voices grew softer. Their hands shook. Their numbers dwindled. Women who had once stood together in barracks or held one another during roll call were now grandmothers telling stories to children raised in peace. Their tattoos faded, but never disappeared. The world began to recognize them as living monuments, reminders of humanity's darkest chapter. Holocaust museums began collecting their testimonies. Shoeboxes filled with letters, diaries, fragments of clothing, yellow stars, and faded photographs became artifacts. These items smelled of old paper, dust, and memory. They carried the weight of lives that could not be rebuilt. Women handed over these objects with reverence and sorrow, knowing they were offering pieces of themselves. The survivors became the voices of the dead. They said the names of children lost in the ghettos. They spoke of mothers who starved themselves to feed their daughters. They recounted the stories of women who smuggled bread, who fought in the resistance, who walked through snow holding hands with friends who were dying. They kept alive the memories of those who had no graves. They became the guardians of truth. The world often expects stories of triumph from survivors. But survival after the Holocaust was not triumph. It was burden, responsibility, haunting, and quiet resilience. Triumph suggests victory. The survivors did not feel victorious. They felt alive. And for many, that was enough. In the end, the aftermath of the Holocaust cannot be neatly summarized. It lived in the survivors' trembling hands, in their cautious smiles, in the way they flinched at loud noises. It lived in their children, who grew up with mothers who held fear behind their eyes and love inside their hearts. It lived in stories told at dinner tables, in conversations whispered at night, in the decision to light candles on holidays that once felt dangerous to celebrate. The women of the ghettos and camps, mothers, daughters, sisters, wives, carried their memories into the rest of the century. They rebuilt, they mourned, they survived, and they made sure the world could never claim ignorance again. Their story does not end in liberation. It does not end in the camps. It does not end in the ghettos. It lives on, in every testimony, every monument, every museum, every classroom, and every whispered prayer. Because these women, who were meant to disappear without a trace, refused to let memory die. Their survival was not merely survival. Their resilience was not merely resilience. Their memory is not merely memory. It is a warning. It is a legacy. It is a promise whispered across generations. Never again.